You know, it's truly wild to think about how much history just vanishes. Like, there are entire civilizations, monumental empires, that simply faded into the desert sands, leaving behind only whispers and a few broken pots. And isn't it strange to consider that some of the most profound shifts in human society, like the very first empires, are shrouded in more mystery than a magician's stage act? We often talk about ancient Egypt or Rome with such familiar ease, yet the very foundations upon which those later giants stood are far more elusive, hidden beneath layers of time and dust. It's like finding out your great-grandparents invented the internet, but all the documentation was lost in a very enthusiastic game of charades. This is especially true for the Akkadian Empire, a name that might not spark immediate recognition in everyone, but whose impact echoes through millennia, even if its actual existence was once a matter of academic debate and archaeological guesswork. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And so, we begin our journey into the enigma that is the Akkadian Empire, a story that truly kicks off in the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia, that ancient land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a place often dubbed the cradle of civilization, which sounds lovely until you remember cradles often get rocked rather violently. Before Akkad, this region was a patchwork quilt of independent Sumerian city-states, each a little world unto itself, like miniature sovereign nations, complete with their own kings, temples, and often their own very particular ways of making war or brewing beer. These cities, places like Ur, Uruk, Lagash, and Kish, had been developing for thousands of years, pushing the boundaries of what humans could achieve, inventing writing, the wheel, complex irrigation systems, and a bureaucracy that would make a modern DMV proud, all while engaging in a delightful pastime of squabbling over land and water rights. Each city proudly boasted its patron deity and its ziggurat, a massive stepped pyramid that seemed to scratch at the heavens, serving as both a spiritual hub and a monumental declaration of civic pride. Imagine every city having its own Eiffel Tower, but built from mud bricks and dedicated to a storm god. The period just before Akkad's emergence, often called the early dynastic period, was a vibrant, messy tapestry of competing interests, a kind of ancient Mesopotamian thunderdome where city-states vied for supremacy, sometimes through diplomacy, more often with spears and maces, while trade flowed and cultural ideas exchanged hands. There was no single unifying political entity that held sway over the entire region. It was more like a collection of very ambitious neighbors who occasionally threw garden parties and more frequently thrown javelins. This fragmented political landscape meant that while individual cities could achieve great power and wealth, their influence was localized, and long-term stability across the entire region remained a distant dream, much like my attempts at keeping a houseplant alive for more than 3 months. The idea of a single, overarching empire controlling multiple cities and diverse populations was, at this point, largely theoretical, a gleam in the eye of some particularly ambitious chieftain, but nothing concrete. And yet, amidst this fractured landscape, a new power began to coalesce, slowly at first, like the assembling of a very determined Lego set in a place whose exact location still eludes us, despite centuries of searching. The city of Akkad itself. We know it existed, of course, because of countless inscriptions and later texts that refer to it with a reverence usually reserved for mythological realms, or exceptionally good falafel. But its precise geographical coordinates remain one of archaeology's enduring cold cases, perhaps buried under centuries of silt, or just really, really well hidden. This mystery surrounding Akkad's physical location only adds to its almost mythical aura, making it feel less like a city and more like a concept, a powerful idea that suddenly burst forth from the Mesopotamian plains, though in reality, it was undoubtedly a bustling urban center, probably with its fair share of market chatter and, ancient traffic jams. Historians still argue whether Akkad was a pre-existing settlement that grew to prominence, or a new foundation built specifically as a capital for an emerging dynasty, a kind of ancient Washington, D.C., but for a much more pointy form of governance. The narrative of Akkad's rise is inextricably linked with one man, a figure so monumental that he almost feels more legend than flesh and blood. Sargon of Akkad. He bursts onto the scene not from the established aristocratic lineages of Sumer, but from a background so humble it borders on the improbable, making him the ancient world's ultimate rags-to-riches story, or perhaps, more accurately, from basket to throne story, a narrative trope that, frankly, still sells movie tickets today. His early life, as recounted in later Mesopotamian literature, reads like an ancient soap opera, complete with abandonment, divine intervention, and a remarkably convenient gardener. We are told he was a foundling set adrift in a basket on the Euphrates, discovered by a water drawer named Aki, and then rose through the ranks as a cupbearer to the king of Kish, Ur-Zababa. This part of the story, while undoubtedly embellished over centuries to elevate Sargon's status and legitimize his rule, contains elements that ring true to the precarious and often brutal nature of power in early Mesopotamia. Whether he was truly a basket case baby or simply a man of extraordinary talent from a modest background, his trajectory was undeniably meteoric, a testament to sheer willpower, and let's be honest, probably a ruthless streak a mile wide. The fact that someone from outside the traditional elite could seize power and establish such a sweeping empire was in itself a revolutionary act, shattering established norms and proving that sometimes the best way to get ahead is to simply grab the reins of power yourself, preferably with an army at your back. Sargon's early career as a cupbearer to the king of Kish, Ur-Zababa, sounds rather innocuous, doesn't it? One imagines someone perhaps refilling a goblet or fetching a royal snack. But in ancient Mesopotamia, this role was anything but trivial. A cupbearer was often a trusted confidant, privy to royal secrets, court intrigue, and the general comings and goings of power. It was less about serving drinks and more about being a highly placed personal assistant with access to the levers of power, a kind of ancient chief of staff, except with more opportunities to, shall we say, accidentally spill the royal wine if the king was being particularly annoying. This position would have given Sargon invaluable insight into the inner workings of governance, the strengths and weaknesses of the existing political structures, and perhaps most crucially, the vulnerabilities of his own monarch. He would have observed alliances forming and dissolving, rebellions simmering, and the endless dance of ambition that defined the Sumerian city-states. The legend then states that Sargon somehow overthrew Ur-Zababa, his erstwhile master, though the details are predictably fuzzy, like trying to recall what you had for breakfast 3 Tuesdays ago. Did he orchestrate a coup? Was there a palace revolt? Did he simply offer a better benefits package to the king's guards? The texts are tantalizingly vague, preferring to focus on the outcome rather than the gritty mechanics of how a cupbearer suddenly became a king. What's clear is that Sargon, once a servant, seized the throne of Kish, a city-state of considerable influence and prestige, especially in the northern part of Sumer. This was no small feat, as Kish had a long history of powerful rulers and strategic importance, making Sargon's takeover a significant declaration of his ambition and nascent power. Like a local band suddenly headlining a stadium tour, it signaled that a new player, one who didn't play by the old rules of inherited power, had arrived on the Mesopotamian stage. Having secured Kish, Sargon didn't rest on his laurels. In fact, he probably didn't even have laurels yet, perhaps just a very nice new crown. Instead, he immediately set about the business of expansion, not just for personal gain, but with a grander vision. He established his own capital city, Akkad, the mysterious location we just discussed. Founding a new capital was a strategic masterstroke, allowing him to create a center of power loyal solely to him, free from the lingering traditions and entrenched interests of older Sumerian cities. It was a blank slate upon which he could begin to sketch the outline of his unprecedented empire. Imagine building a new company headquarters from scratch, designing it specifically for maximum efficiency and control, rather than trying to retrofit an old creaky building with 1,000,000 cubicles. This move demonstrated Sargon's foresight and his understanding of how to consolidate power both militarily and symbolically. From Akkad, Sargon embarked on a series of military campaigns that would forever alter the political map of Mesopotamia. His initial targets were the very city-states that had for so long dominated the region, the proud Sumerian centers like Uruk, Ur, and Lagash. These cities, while powerful individually, were accustomed to fighting among themselves, often forming shifting alliances that could be both beneficial and detrimental, much like trying to organize a potluck with too many cooks. Sargon, however, approached conquest with a different mindset, one of systematic subjugation, not just temporary dominance. His military strategy was swift and decisive, a brutal efficiency that caught many off guard. He didn't just win battles, he dismantled the existing power structures, replacing local rulers with his own loyal governors and administrators, ensuring that the conquered territories remained firmly under his thumb. The speed and scale of Sargon's conquests were truly remarkable for the era. He wasn't just raiding, he was building, or rather rebuilding, a unified political entity. One moment, Sumer was a collection of independent kingdoms. The next, it was rapidly becoming a single, centralized domain under Sargon's command. This was a radical departure from the norm. Before Sargon, Mesopotamian hegemony usually meant one city-state temporarily dominating a few others, extracting tribute, and then losing control as soon as its military might waned. Sargon's vision was different. He sought permanent integration, creating a political system that could endure beyond the battlefield. He didn't just demand tribute. He established a new order, a new administrative apparatus designed to govern a vast territory, which, in a place notorious for its independent streak, was a bit like trying to herd very opinionated cats. His campaigns were not without fierce resistance, of course. The Sumerian city-states, proud of their long histories and traditions, weren't about to roll over and play dead just because some upstart from Kish showed up with a big army. There were numerous rebellions, counterattacks, and desperate last stands. Sargon, however, was relentless. He crushed these insurrections with unwavering determination, often employing tactics that were brutal by any standard, though perhaps not uncommon for the time. The goal was not merely victory, but utter submission. He understood that to forge an empire, he needed to break the spirit of independence that had defined Sumer for centuries. He sacked cities, destroyed defensive walls, and brought back immense quantities of plunder, not just for wealth, but to demonstrate his absolute superiority. It was a clear message: resist at your peril, or join the new order and thrive. As he expanded his dominion, Sargon began to implement policies that would solidify his rule. He dismantled the old network of independent city-state rulers and installed his own trusted officials, often Akkadians, in positions of power. This was a direct assault on the traditional Sumerian power structure, replacing hereditary local rulers with loyal appointees, effectively centralizing authority in Akkad. He also began to standardize weights and measures, a seemingly mundane detail that had profound economic implications, facilitating trade and taxation across his burgeoning empire, making it easier to do business, and more importantly for Sargon, easier to collect taxes. Imagine trying to run a country where every town uses a different system for counting sheep or measuring grain. Sargon was basically introducing the metric system to a chaotic ancient world, which, let's be honest, is a form of benevolent tyranny if ever there was one. The sheer scale of his success in unifying Sumer led to the creation of something truly unprecedented: the world's first true empire. While there had been powerful kingdoms before, none had achieved the level of sustained territorial control and centralized administration that Sargon was now forging. He wasn't just a powerful king, he was an emperor, ruling over a diverse collection of peoples, languages, and cultures, all brought under the banner of Akkad. This transition from a collection of independent city-states to a unified empire was a watershed moment in human history, laying the groundwork for all future imperial endeavors, teaching us that sometimes all it takes is one really determined person to change everything, especially if they're good at military logistics. The Sumerian people, who had for so long enjoyed their autonomy, now found themselves part of a larger unified entity, with a capital they might never visit, and a ruler whose name would become synonymous with power itself. With the unification of Sumer under his iron fist, Sargon wasn't content to simply sit back and admire his newly acquired empire. Probably because in ancient Mesopotamia, sitting back usually meant someone was about to stab you with a pointy stick. No, Sargon understood that an empire wasn't just built, it had to be maintained, and that required a whole new level of organizational genius, far beyond simply conquering cities. He began to implement a revolutionary system of imperial administration, moving beyond the ad hoc arrangements of previous regional powers to create a bureaucracy that could actually manage his vast new domain. This was like upgrading from a local corner shop to a multinational corporation, and Sargon was suddenly the CEO, COO, and head of HR, all rolled into one impressively bearded package. One of Sargon's most crucial administrative innovations was the establishment of a centralized governmental structure. Before him, power was largely decentralized, residing with individual city-states and their local rulers. Sargon flipped that script. He appointed loyal governors, often chosen from his inner circle of Akkadian confidants, to oversee each conquered region. These governors weren't merely local figureheads. They were direct representatives of the central authority in Akkad, responsible for collecting taxes, enforcing Sargon's laws, and maintaining order. This move significantly curtailed the power of the old Sumerian priestly class and hereditary elite, ensuring that true power emanated from Akkad, rather than from dozens of squabbling local potentates. It was a clear shift from a federal system to a more unitary one, where Sargon pulled all the strings like a very busy puppeteer. To ensure these governors remained loyal and effective, Sargon established a sophisticated system of communication and control. Messages flowed rapidly along established routes, sometimes even using a rudimentary postal system, allowing Sargon to receive intelligence and issue commands across his empire with remarkable speed for the era. Imagine trying to run an empire without email or even a telegraph. It required a network of dedicated runners and perhaps some very fast donkeys. This network wasn't just for military dispatches. It facilitated the flow of information on harvests, trade, and potential unrest, giving Sargon a bird's-eye view of his vast territories. This capacity for rapid communication was a significant advantage, allowing him to react swiftly to rebellions or threats, rather than waiting weeks for news to trickle in, by which time a rebellion might have already brewed its own beer and declared independence. Furthermore, Sargon understood the importance of economic integration for imperial stability. He didn't just conquer territories. He sought to bind them together economically. This meant promoting standardized weights and measures across the empire, which, while it sounds dreadfully boring, was actually revolutionary. Imagine trying to trade grain when every city has a different definition of what a bushel is, or trying to collect taxes when a pound of silver in one town weighs entirely differently in another. Sargon's standardization eliminated this chaos, fostering more efficient trade, making taxation simpler, and generally allowing commerce to flow more smoothly. It was like introducing a universal currency in a world of disparate local tokens, making everyone's lives a little easier, especially the tax collectors. This economic cohesion strengthened the imperial fabric, making the conquered peoples more reliant on the central authority for their prosperity, which is always a good move if you want to keep them from revolting too often. He also paid close attention to the irrigation systems, the lifeblood of Mesopotamian agriculture. The rivers and canals were crucial for crop yields, and Sargon ensured that these vital networks were maintained and even expanded under imperial oversight. This wasn't merely a benevolent act. Controlling the water supply was a powerful tool of governance. It allowed Akkad to ensure food security for its growing population and, implicitly, to exert leverage over regions that depended on imperial management of these resources. After all, nobody wants to rebel against the guy who controls the water tap, especially in a place where water is literally life. This careful management of resources underscored Sargon's practical approach to empire building, demonstrating that he understood the fundamental needs of his subjects and how to leverage them for his own strategic advantage. Sargon also understood the power of ideology and symbolism. He didn't just rule by force. He cultivated a powerful image of himself as a divinely sanctioned ruler, chosen by the gods to bring order and prosperity to the land, while later rulers, particularly his grandson Naram-Sin, would take this much further. Sargon laid the groundwork for the concept of the King of the Four Quarters of the world, a title that projected universal dominion and an authority that transcended mere regional kingship. He promoted the Akkadian language alongside Sumerian, particularly in administrative and official contexts, gradually elevating its status and further integrating the conquered territories into the Akkadian cultural sphere. This was a subtle but powerful form of cultural assimilation, teaching everyone to speak the emperor's language, which, let's be honest, makes giving orders much easier. One fascinating aspect of Sargon's administration was his reported creation of a standing army, a professional military force loyal directly to him, rather than relying on levies from individual city-states. While the exact size and permanence of this force are debated by scholars, the concept itself was groundbreaking. Prior to this, armies were often temporary gatherings of citizens or tribal levies, assembled for specific campaigns and then disbanded. A standing army, however, represented a constant projection of power, a ready force to suppress rebellions, defend borders, and conduct further conquests. This allowed Sargon to maintain continuous control over his vast territory and project force outwards, securing trade routes and deterring potential enemies. It was like having a permanent security detail for your entire country, which, for a fledgling empire, was an absolute game-changer. This administrative sophistication was truly what set the Akkadian Empire apart. It wasn't just a powerful kingdom. It was an integrated state with a clear hierarchy, centralized decision-making, and mechanisms for control that extended far beyond the immediate reach of the capital. Sargon's genius lay not just in his military prowess, but in his understanding that true power lay in structure and organization, in creating a system that could outlast any individual king. Historians still argue whether Sargon's administrative apparatus was entirely novel, or if he merely perfected existing Sumerian concepts on a grander scale. But there's no denying the scale and effectiveness of his centralized governance. He basically built the blueprint for future empires, showing everyone how to effectively manage a really big, diverse, and often grumpy population, a feat that would make any modern CEO green with envy. His rule laid the bedrock for generations of Mesopotamian power, proving that even in a chaotic world, order could be imposed if you just had enough determination and, presumably, a very large army. To truly understand the formidable nature of the Akkadian Empire under Sargon, we must delve into the very sinews of its power, his military machine. This wasn't just a collection of brave warriors. It was an organized, disciplined, and remarkably effective fighting force, a true innovation in ancient warfare that set Sargon apart from his predecessors. Before Sargon, armies in Mesopotamia were often composed of citizen militias, levied from the populace when needed for defense or short campaigns, and then disbanded. Imagine your local knitting circle suddenly being called up for military service. It might work for a quick skirmish, but probably not for sustained conquest. Sargon, however, pioneered the concept of a professional standing army, a force that was continuously trained, equipped, and maintained, loyal directly to him, not to their local city or temple. This professionalization of the military meant several things. Firstly, it allowed for specialized training. Akkadian soldiers weren't just farmers with spears. They were drilled in formations, tactics, and the use of various weapons. This elevated their effectiveness significantly over less organized opponents. Think of it like the difference between a neighborhood soccer team and a professional league club. Both play the game, but one is clearly operating on a different level of skill and coordination. Sargon's army was capable of executing complex maneuvers, maintaining discipline under pressure, and enduring prolonged campaigns, something that would have been a significant challenge for less cohesive forces. Secondly, a standing army provided Sargon with unprecedented flexibility and reach. He didn't have to wait for city-states to raise their levies or for farmers to finish their harvest before embarking on a campaign. His forces were always ready, allowing for rapid deployment and surprise attacks. This speed of response was a major factor in his ability to crush rebellions swiftly and extend his dominion far beyond the traditional Sumerian heartland. He could project power outward, securing trade routes, raiding distant lands for resources, and deterring potential invaders, transforming his empire from a defensive entity into an aggressively expansionist one. It's like having a superpower that allows you to instantly respond to every minor emergency, whether it's a rogue sheep or a rebellious king. The Akkadian army was likely composed of various specialized units, though details are frustratingly a bit scarce. We know they utilized infantry, probably armed with spears, axes, and daggers, protected by shields. There's evidence of archers, a crucial component for ranged attacks and softening up enemy lines before the main assault. While chariots existed in Mesopotamia, their role in Sargon's early campaigns is debated. They were often heavy, ox-drawn carts at this point, more for transport or carrying standard bearers than for rapid maneuver, though they would become more prominent later. The key, however, wasn't just the individual weapons, but the tactical deployment of these forces. Sargon likely employed combined arms tactics, using archers to disrupt enemy formations before his disciplined infantry charged. Archaeological evidence and later artistic depictions, like fragments of victory steles, give us glimpses into the Akkadian military's appearance and gear. Soldiers are often depicted with a distinctive metal helmet, sometimes with horns, though these might have been ceremonial or for high-ranking individuals. They wore simple tunics, and their primary protection would have been large shields. The uniformity, even if idealized in art, suggests a deliberate effort towards standardization in equipment, another hallmark of a professional army. This also served a psychological purpose. A disciplined, uniformly equipped force would have presented a formidable and intimidating sight to less organized opponents, making them think twice before challenging Akkad's might. Sargon's military campaigns were not confined to Mesopotamia proper. He famously pushed his armies far beyond the traditional boundaries of Sumer and Akkad. He campaigned extensively in Elam to the east, a powerful neighbor that had frequently clashed with Sumerian city-states. He also led expeditions to the west, reaching as far as the Cedar Forest, likely modern Lebanon, and the Silver Mountains, probably parts of Anatolia, though the extent of sustained control over these distant lands is debated. These far-flung expeditions served multiple purposes: securing valuable resources like timber and metals that were scarce in Mesopotamia, establishing trade routes, and perhaps most importantly, projecting the image of an all-conquering monarch. He was demonstrating that Akkad was not just a regional power, but a force to be reckoned with across the entire Near East. This kind of long-distance campaigning required incredible logistical support, something Sargon's centralized administration was likely designed to provide, ensuring his armies were supplied with food, water, and equipment far from home. No easy feat when your supply chain involves literal donkeys. The very concept of the King of the Four Quarters, a title Sargon often used, wasn't just poetic flourish. It was a reflection of his military ambition and success. It implied dominion over the entire known world, a claim to universal sovereignty that resonated deeply in the ancient Mesopotamian worldview. This title, later adopted by other powerful rulers, originated with Sargon, a testament to the unprecedented scale of his conquests. He wasn't just king of Akkad. He was, in his own mind, and increasingly in the minds of others, the ruler of all creation, which is a pretty bold claim to make, even if you've only conquered a few cities, let alone an entire region. Of course, maintaining such a vast military machine came with significant costs. It required constant resources, food, weapons, and manpower. This pressure undoubtedly fueled the need for efficient taxation and resource extraction from the conquered territories, forming a feedback loop where military success enabled greater resource acquisition, which in turn supported a larger military. This constant demand for resources and tribute would become a recurring theme in the history of the Akkadian Empire, a double-edged sword that enabled its power, but also sowed the seeds of discontent among its subjects. Historians still argue whether the Akkadian army relied more heavily on conscription or voluntary service, though it's likely a mix of both, adapting to the needs of specific campaigns and the availability of manpower, a bit like how modern militaries juggle between different recruitment strategies. Ultimately, Sargon's military machine was more than just a tool for conquest. It was the backbone of his empire. It was the means by which he forged his vast dominion, suppressed dissent, and projected his authority across a diverse and often hostile landscape. It was a symbol of his power, a testament to his tactical genius, and a terrifying reminder to anyone who dared to challenge the first true emperor in history. The roar of the Akkadian army, with its disciplined formations and relentless advance, must have been a truly fearsome sound, echoing across the Mesopotamian plains, marking the arrival of a new era of centralized power and unprecedented imperial ambition. And let's be honest, few things are as persuasive as a well-organized army, especially when they're knocking on your city gates with very large axes. The creation of the Akkadian Empire was not just a story of military might and administrative prowess. It was also a fascinating tale of cultural assimilation and the inevitable friction of resistance. When Sargon swept across Sumer, He didn't just conquer territories. He brought two distinct, yet interconnected cultures into direct, often uncomfortable contact. The Sumerians, with their millennia-old traditions, their cuneiform writing, their complex pantheon of gods, and their sophisticated urban centers, suddenly found themselves under the rule of Akkadians, a people who spoke a different Semitic language, worshipped a slightly different set of deities, and, crucially, had just demonstrated a rather aggressive knack for empire building. This was a bit like trying to merge two very old, very opinionated families under one roof, with one family suddenly in charge of all the chores and the other grumbling about how things used to be. Initially, Sargon's approach to the conquered Sumerian population was pragmatic, aiming for control rather than outright obliteration of their culture. He understood that to effectively govern such a vast and established region, some degree of cultural accommodation was necessary. Therefore, while Akkadian became the language of administration and the military, Sumerian continued to be used widely, particularly in religious contexts and for literary purposes. It was a kind of bilingual empire, with official decrees often appearing in both languages, a practice that helped to ease the transition and maintain some semblance of continuity for the conquered populace. Imagine a modern country where official documents are published in both English and, say, Klingon, just to make sure everyone feels included, even if one language is clearly dominant. This linguistic duality also meant that scribes had to be proficient in both, fostering a fascinating intellectual exchange and preservation of Sumerian literary traditions. However, beneath this veneer of pragmatic coexistence, there were significant efforts at cultural integration and, implicitly, Akkadianization. Sargon and his successors promoted the worship of Akkadian deities, particularly Ishtar, the goddess of war and love, and Shamash, the sun god, alongside or sometimes even above the traditional Sumerian pantheon. Temples dedicated to Akkadian gods were established in Sumerian cities, and Akkadian religious festivals gained prominence. This wasn't necessarily an aggressive suppression of Sumerian religion, but rather an elevation of Akkadian religious practices, aiming to weave a common religious fabric that bound the empire together under Akkad's spiritual authority. It was a soft power play, gently nudging people towards the imperial way of thinking, like subtly changing the background music in a shop to influence buying habits. Furthermore, Sargon began to appoint Akkadians to key administrative and religious positions within the conquered Sumerian cities. This was a deliberate policy to dilute the power of the traditional Sumerian elite and ensure loyalty to the central government in Akkad. Sumerian city governors, priests, and military commanders were gradually replaced by Sargon's trusted appointees, or at least had their authority significantly curtailed. This wasn't always popular, as you can imagine. Imagine your local mayor suddenly being replaced by someone from a faraway capital who doesn't even speak your dialect. There would be a fair bit of grumbling, to say the least. This top-down imposition of Akkadian personnel aimed to create a unified administrative structure, but it also inevitably generated resentment among the displaced Sumerian aristocracy and populace. This brings us to the flip side of assimilation: resistance. The unification of Sumer under Sargon's rule was anything but a smooth, peaceful process. The independent Sumerian city-states, proud of their centuries-old autonomy, did not willingly submit to Akkadian dominance. Rebellions were frequent and often brutal, erupting across the empire like a persistent rash. These were not mere skirmishes. They were often widespread insurrections, sometimes involving multiple city-states banding together in a desperate attempt to reclaim their sovereignty. Sargon and his successors spent considerable time and resources quelling these uprisings, indicating the persistent spirit of defiance among the conquered populations. It was a constant game of whack-a-mole, where every time one rebellion was crushed, another seemed to pop up somewhere else, usually with a freshly sharpened stick. The nature of this resistance varied. Sometimes it was overt military rebellion, as city-states would revolt, expel Akkadian garrisons, and declare independence. Other times, it might have been more subtle. A quiet refusal to pay taxes, a slowdown in production, or the harboring of anti-Akkadian sentiments. The cycle of conquest, rebellion, and suppression became a defining feature of the early empire. Sargon himself, for all his military brilliance, reportedly faced numerous revolts throughout his reign. The revolt of the city-states is a well-documented example, where many of the major Sumerian cities simultaneously rose up against Akkadian rule, forcing Sargon to reconquer territories he had already subdued. This suggests that despite his initial victories, the integration of Sumer into the Akkadian system was a continuous, often violent, process rather than a one-time event. The tensions between Sumerian and Akkadian cultural identities would persist throughout the empire's existence, even as the two cultures began to intertwine. Akkadian art, while distinct, often drew inspiration from Sumerian motifs and iconography. Sumerian literary works were copied, studied, and preserved by Akkadian scribes. This cultural exchange created a rich, syncretic Mesopotamian culture, a blend of the old and the new, the conquered and the conquerors. Historians still argue whether the Akkadian cultural imposition was ultimately beneficial for long-term stability, or if it sowed deeper seeds of discontent that contributed to the empire's eventual decline. What is clear is that the process was never entirely harmonious. A constant negotiation between imperial ambition and local identity, much like trying to get everyone in a family to agree on what to watch on movie night. Ultimately, Sargon's legacy in terms of cultural assimilation was a mixed bag. He succeeded in forging a unified political entity and laid the groundwork for a broader Mesopotamian identity that transcended individual city-states. However, he also ignited a deep-seated resistance among some Sumerian factions that would flare up repeatedly, a testament to the enduring power of local identity and the difficulty of truly erasing centuries of independent tradition. The Akkadian Empire, while culturally rich and administratively advanced, was always navigating this delicate balance, a constant dance between imposing its will and incorporating the rich heritage of those it ruled. And that, dear listeners, is a tightrope walk that even the most powerful emperors eventually discover is fraught with peril. As the sun began to set on the glorious reign of Sargon, casting long shadows across his vast empire, the mantle of power passed to his sons, Raimush, and then Manishtushu. This period, following the initial burst of Sargon's conquests, was characterized by the ongoing challenge of consolidating and maintaining control over an empire that was, by its very nature, a collection of recently subdued, often rebellious, territories. Imagine building an incredibly intricate house of cards. The initial construction is thrilling, but keeping it from toppling over in a slight breeze requires constant, delicate effort. Rimush, Sargon's immediate successor, inherited not a peaceful dominion, but a realm simmering with discontent and outright revolt, a kind of immediate baptism by fire for the new emperor. Rimush's reign, Sati, 2278-2270 BCE. Though dates are always a bit fuzzy in this ancient world, like trying to read a menu in a very dimly lit restaurant, was largely dominated by the need to suppress widespread rebellions, particularly in Sumer. It seems that many of the Sumerian city-states, perhaps emboldened by the change in leadership or simply exhausted by Akkadian rule, saw Sargon's passing as an opportunity to reclaim their lost autonomy. Lagash, and other prominent Sumerian centers rose in revolt, forcing Rimush to embark on arduous military campaigns to re-establish Akkadian authority. His inscriptions boast of crushing these rebellions with considerable ferocity, executing thousands and plundering cities. A stark reminder that empire building was never a gentle affair, even for the inheritors of a great legacy. He effectively reconquered much of what his father had subdued, proving that the Akkadian military machine remained formidable, even if it was constantly being put to the test. However, Rimush's reign was relatively short, ending, as so often happened in ancient royal courts, under mysterious and violent circumstances. Later texts suggest he was assassinated, possibly by his own courtiers, perhaps a victim of internal power struggles or the sheer exhaustion of constant warfare. Succession in early empires was rarely a smooth handover, more often a brutal scramble for power, and Rimush's fate underscores the precariousness of even imperial authority. It's a stark reminder that while one might conquer external enemies, the threats from within the palace walls can be far more insidious. Following Rimush, his brother Manishtushu ascended the throne, Sati, 2269-2255 BCE. Manishtushu continued the work of consolidation, though perhaps with a slightly different focus than his brother. While he too had to deal with rebellions, his reign seems to have placed a greater emphasis on economic stability and external trade. He reportedly campaigned in Elam, the mountainous region to the east of Mesopotamia, and across the Persian Gulf, reaching as far as Magan, likely Oman, to secure valuable resources like copper, diorite, and exotic woods. These expeditions highlight the Akkadian Empire's continued interest in controlling key trade routes and acquiring raw materials crucial for its economy and monumental building projects. Imagine an ancient world CEO diversifying his supply chain, except instead of semiconductors, he's after really sturdy rocks for statues. Manishtushu is also known for a remarkable artifact, a large carved stone obelisk, inscribed with details of his land acquisitions and administrative policies. This obelisk of Manishtushu provides invaluable insight into the economic workings of the empire, detailing how he purchased large tracts of land, possibly to consolidate royal holdings or to reward loyal officials. It speaks to a sophisticated land management system and an active royal involvement in the agricultural economy. Such an inscription also served as a powerful propaganda tool, showcasing the king's wealth, generosity, and control over resources, effectively saying, "Look at all this land I just bought. Don't even think about messing with me." However, it was under Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson and Manishtushu's son, that the Akkadian Empire reached its zenith, achieving its greatest territorial extent and experiencing a period of unparalleled cultural and artistic flourishing. Naram-Sin's reign, c. 2254 to 218 BCE, represents a pivotal moment in Mesopotamian history, not just for the empire's power, but for the profound shift in royal ideology that he pioneered. He wasn't just a powerful king. He was something new, something unprecedented in the ancient world. Naram-Sin inherited a still unstable, yet fundamentally powerful, empire. The rebellions under his father and uncle had been suppressed, but the underlying tensions remained. Naram-Sin, however, possessed an even grander vision than his predecessors, a vision that pushed the boundaries of traditional Mesopotamian kingship. He was not content to be merely king of Akkad, or even king of the Four Quarters. Naram-Sin aimed for something far more audacious: divinity. He became the first Mesopotamian ruler to explicitly claim to be a living god, adorning his name with the determinative for divine, a star symbol typically reserved for deities. This was a radical departure from established norms, where kings were seen as divinely appointed or favored by the gods, but never gods themselves. It was like a pop star declaring themselves a new genre of music. Audacious, but if it works, it's revolutionary. This unprecedented claim to divinity had profound implications. It elevated Naram-Sin above all other mortals, making him the supreme authority, whose word was essentially divine law. It served to further legitimize his rule, attempting to quell any lingering doubts about his right to govern by placing him beyond human challenge. It also blurred the lines between the sacred and the secular, consolidating immense spiritual and temporal power in his person. Imagine a ruler who could not only order you to pay taxes, but also demand your religious devotion as a living deity. That's a whole new level of authority. This deification was not merely a vanity project. It was a carefully calculated move to strengthen the imperial ideology and to project an aura of unchallengeable authority over his diverse and often recalcitrant subjects. Naram-Sin's reign also saw extensive military expansion, pushing the empire's boundaries further than ever before. He campaigned widely, from the mountainous regions of the Zagros to the east, subduing the Lullaby people, to Syria in the west, and even securing trade routes to Magan, Oman, and Meluha, the Indus Valley civilization, through the Persian Gulf. These campaigns were not just about conquest. They were about securing resources, controlling vital trade networks, and projecting Akkadian power across the known world. His military might was truly unparalleled, allowing the empire to reach its greatest territorial extent, an impressive feat that involved managing vast distances and diverse enemies. The artistic representations from Naram-Sin's time reflect this new imperial ideology and grandiosity. The most famous example is the Stele of Naram-Sin, a masterpiece of Mesopotamian art that we'll explore in more detail next. This monument vividly portrays Naram-Sin as a triumphant, godlike figure, trampling his enemies, with a horned helmet signifying his divinity, and literally reaching for the stars. It's not just a depiction of a military victory. It's a statement of divine right, imperial power, and individual glory, a visual manifesto of Naram-Sin's audacious claims. The stele, along with other artifacts from his reign, shows a clear shift towards grander, more monumental art, designed to glorify the emperor and the empire. a bit like those very large, slightly intimidating statues you see in corporate lobbies, but with more dead enemies. Under Naram-Sin, the Akkadian Empire truly embodied its title, becoming a dominant force across the Near East, a sprawling realm connected by trade, administration, and the powerful persona of its divine emperor. This period was a peak of Mesopotamian civilization, demonstrating the immense potential of centralized power to foster economic prosperity, artistic achievement, and military dominance. But as with all peaks, a descent would eventually follow. And even divine emperors, as it turns out, are not immune to the relentless march of time or the persistent incursions of grumpy barbarians. When we consider the high water mark of the Akkadian Empire, it is impossible to overlook the reign of Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, whose ambition and achievements propelled Akkad to its absolute zenith. He wasn't just a king, he was a revolutionary, not just in his military conquests, but in his very self-conception, daring to claim a status no Mesopotamian ruler before him had ever truly asserted: divinity. This wasn't merely a flattering title or a poetic exaggeration. Naram-Sin explicitly used the divine determinative, a star symbol, before his name in written inscriptions, effectively declaring himself a living god, like a rock star deciding they're now an entire galaxy. This audacious claim was a profound break from Mesopotamian tradition. Previously, kings were seen as chosen by the gods, favored by them, or even descendants of divine beings. But they were not themselves deities. Their authority stemmed from their relationship with the divine, not from their inherent divinity. Naram-Sin shattered this theological barrier, positioning himself as the ultimate source of authority, beyond reproach or question. This deification served multiple strategic purposes. Firstly, it would have been a powerful tool for legitimizing his rule over a vast and diverse empire, especially one still prone to rebellion. If the emperor was a god, then to defy him was to defy the heavens themselves, a concept that would have carried immense weight in a deeply religious society. It was like adding an extra layer of spiritual intimidation to his already considerable military might. Secondly, claiming divinity served to unify a disparate empire. By making himself the central object of veneration, Naram-Sin created a common focal point of loyalty that transcended regional identities, local deities, and the lingering resentments of conquered peoples. Everyone, from Sumerian farmer to Elamite captive, was expected to acknowledge the divine authority of Naram-Sin. This created a powerful imperial cult, binding the empire together not just by force, but by assured, albeit imposed, spiritual allegiance. Imagine trying to get everyone to agree on a favorite pizza topping, and Naram-Sin just declared himself the supreme topping, and everyone had to like it. Naram-Sin's deification is vividly captured in the iconic stele of Naram-Sin, a masterpiece of Akkadian art and propaganda, arguably one of the most famous artifacts from ancient Mesopotamia. This pink limestone stele, standing over 6 feet tall, depicts Naram-Sin in a triumphant military scene, trampling his enemies. But it's not just a battle scene. It's a theological statement. Naram-Sin is shown wearing a horned helmet, traditionally reserved for deities, symbolizing his divine status. He stands tall, gazing up at 2 star-like rosettes, which represent the sun god Shamash and the goddess Ishtar, suggesting either their blessing or his equality with them. Below him, his enemies lie crushed and begging for mercy, their bodies contorted in defeat, while his disciplined Akkadian soldiers march in orderly ranks behind him, ascending a mountain. The symbolism in the stele of Naram-Sin is incredibly rich. The mountain setting itself might represent the divine realm or a specific campaign in the Zagros Mountains, where Naram-Sin famously campaigned against the lullaby. The orderly march of his troops contrasts sharply with the chaotic disarray of his defeated foes, emphasizing Akkadian discipline and divine favor. Naram-Sin himself is depicted with a powerful, idealized physique, a testament to Akkadian artistic conventions that celebrated strength and virility. He literally stands above the fray, his foot crushing one enemy, his spear poised to strike another, embodying the relentless power of the divine emperor. This stele was not just a record of victory. It was a permanent, public declaration of Naram-Sin's unprecedented status and the unassailable might of his empire. Like a really old, very impressive billboard advertising imperial dominance. Beyond the audacious claim to divinity, Naram-Sin continued the work of military expansion, pushing the empire's borders to their greatest extent. He launched campaigns into the mountainous regions of the Zagros, east of Mesopotamia, conquering the fiercely independent Lullaby and Gutian tribes. These were not easy victories. The mountainous terrain favored the defenders, and these tribes were known for their resilience and guerrilla tactics. His victories here were crucial for securing the eastern flank of the empire and controlling valuable trade routes that passed through these regions. He also campaigned extensively in Syria, conquering cities like Ebla and establishing Akkadian control over key trade networks that reached as far as Anatolia, modern Turkey, for tin and silver. Naram-Sin's dominion even extended to the south, engaging in maritime trade with distant lands like Magan, modern Oman, for copper, and Meluha, the Indus Valley civilization, for exotic goods like carnelian, lapis lazuli, and possibly gold. This vast economic reach, facilitated by secure trade routes, underscored the immense power and wealth of the Akkadian Empire under his rule. Imagine ancient merchant ships sailing across the Persian Gulf, laden with goods from a civilization thousands of miles away, all thanks to the stability and reach of Akkad. These extensive trade networks not only enriched the empire, but also connected Mesopotamia to a wider world, facilitating cultural exchange and the flow of ideas, proving that sometimes even empire builders are accidental cultural ambassadors. However, Naram-Sin's reign, for all its glory, also saw the seeds of future decline being sown. His aggressive campaigns and the heavy demands of maintaining such a vast empire put immense strain on resources and manpower. The constant need to suppress rebellions, fueled in part by his own extreme claims of divinity and the heavy hand of Akkadian administration, created a cycle of conflict. While he was victorious, these continuous wars undoubtedly drained the empire's vitality. Historians still argue whether Naram-Sin's deification was a brilliant stroke of genius or an act of hubris that ultimately alienated his subjects and contributed to the empire's later struggles. Perhaps it made him seem too remote, too unapproachable, or simply too much of a challenge to the old ways. Nevertheless, the era of Naram-Sin remains the golden age of the Akkadian Empire. It was a period when Mesopotamia witnessed unprecedented centralization of power, a flourishing of art and culture, and the audacious ambition of a ruler who redefined kingship itself. His legacy was one of immense power and profound change, demonstrating the extraordinary heights to which a single individual, even one from humble beginnings, could propel a civilization. He was the epitome of the powerful, divine monarch, a concept that would echo through the ages, influencing future rulers from Mesopotamia to Egypt and beyond. But even divine emperors, as we know, eventually face challenges that test the very foundations of their power and the world they created. Beyond the grand military conquests and the audacious claims of divine kingship, the Akkadian Empire under Sargon, and particularly Naram-Sin, was also a period of remarkable economic innovation and expansion of trade networks. While we often focus on the clash of swords and the rise and fall of kings, the daily lifeblood of any empire flows through its markets, its farms, and its trade routes. Much like the relentless hum of commerce you hear even in the smallest modern towns. The Akkadians understood this implicitly, transforming the localized economies of the Sumerian city-states into a vast interconnected imperial system, a kind of ancient economic superhighway that facilitated the flow of goods, resources, and wealth. One of the foundational aspects of this economic prosperity was agriculture. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, was incredibly fertile, relying on the annual floods of the Tigris and Euphrates, managed by sophisticated irrigation systems that had been developed over millennia by the Sumerians. The Akkadians continued and even expanded these systems, recognizing that a stable food supply was paramount for feeding their growing population, their vast armies, and the urban centers of the empire. Controlling these vital waterways and ensuring efficient distribution of agricultural produce was a key administrative function, allowing the central government to collect vast amounts of grain and other foodstuffs as taxes, which could then be redistributed or stored to prevent famine. Imagine the logistics of managing an empire-wide agricultural system without computers or even proper maps. It required meticulous record-keeping and a formidable bureaucracy. However, Mesopotamia was notoriously poor in essential raw materials. Timber, metals, like copper, tin, and silver, and precious stones were all scarce. This geographical reality meant that trade was not just beneficial, but absolutely vital for the empire's survival and prosperity. The Akkadians, therefore, invested heavily in securing and controlling long-distance trade routes. They expanded upon existing Sumerian trade networks, transforming them into imperial arteries that supplied Akkad with the resources it desperately needed for tool production, weapons manufacturing, monumental building projects, and luxury goods for the elite. It was a bit like a modern nation relying on global supply chains, except instead of container ships, they had very brave merchants and their donkey caravans. To the east, the Akkadian Empire engaged in extensive trade with Elam and the Iranian plateau, obtaining tin, silver, and various minerals. Tin, in particular, was crucial, as it was a key component in producing bronze, the superior metal of the age. Controlling the flow of tin meant control over advanced metallurgy, giving the Akkadian military a significant advantage. To the west, expeditions reached into Syria and Anatolia, modern Turkey, securing timber from the cedar forests of Lebanon and silver from the Anatolian mines. The famous campaigns of Naram-Sin in these regions were as much about securing these valuable resources as they were about military glory. Perhaps the most impressive aspect of Akkadian trade was its maritime connections via the Persian Gulf. Akkadian ships sailed to distant lands in what is now the Arabian Peninsula and beyond. They traded with Magan, modern Oman, for copper, a fundamental metal for tools and weapons, and diorite, a hard stone used for monumental statues and votive objects. Even more astonishing were the connections with Meluha, widely believed to be the Indus Valley civilization, located in present-day Pakistan and India. From Meluha, the Akkadians acquired exotic goods like carnelian beads, lapis lazuli, a vibrant blue stone, and possibly cotton and even gold. The discovery of Akkadian seals in Indus Valley sites and Indus seals in Mesopotamian sites provides tangible evidence of this remarkable long-distance maritime commerce. Imagine the bravery of those ancient sailors venturing into unknown waters, relying on winds and rudimentary navigation, all to bring back goods that adorn the palaces and temples of Akkad. The empire also implemented measures to facilitate and regulate this extensive commerce. The standardization of weights and measures mentioned earlier was a crucial economic innovation by ensuring that a mina of silver or a gur of grain meant the same thing across the empire. It eliminated confusion, reduced fraud, and made large-scale trade and taxation far more efficient. This created a more predictable and trustworthy economic environment, encouraging merchants to conduct business across greater distances. It was the ancient world's version of a universally accepted currency and quality control, making transactions smoother for everyone involved, except perhaps for those who preferred the chaotic, unregulated market for their dubious dealings. Moreover, the central administration likely played a significant role in financing and organizing large-scale expeditions, both military and commercial. The palace and temple complexes acted as major economic centers, accumulating wealth and redistributing resources, effectively functioning as central banks and distribution hubs. Royal inscriptions often boast of the vast amounts of tribute and plunder brought back to Akkad, filling its coffers and fueling its ambitious projects. This centralization of economic power allowed for the mobilization of resources on a scale previously unseen, enabling the construction of monumental public works and the maintenance of a powerful army. The prosperity brought by these economic innovations and vast trade networks undeniably contributed to the flourishing of Akkadian culture and art. Wealth from trade meant more resources for artisans, sculptors, and architects, leading to the creation of the masterpieces we admire today. It also supported a growing class of scribes, administrators, and specialized laborers, further cementing the empire's complex social and economic structure. Historians still argue whether the economic benefits of empire truly trickle down to the average citizen, or if the vast majority of wealth remained concentrated at the top, fueling the imperial elite. However, there's no denying that the Akkadian period marked a significant expansion in the scale and sophistication of Mesopotamian economic life. In essence, the Akkadian Empire was not just a military juggernaut. It was an economic powerhouse, a testament to the fact that even in the ancient world, power was inextricably linked to wealth, resources, and the ability to connect disparate regions through networks of commerce. Sargon and Naram-Sin understood that controlling the flow of goods was as important as controlling the flow of armies, laying the groundwork for future empires that would similarly leverage economic might to sustain their vast dominions. And while their methods might have been less subtle than modern economic policies, the underlying principles of resource acquisition and trade remained remarkably similar, proving that some lessons are truly timeless. As the Akkadian Empire reached its pinnacle under Naram-Sin, this era of unprecedented power and wealth naturally fostered a remarkable flowering of art and architecture. You see, when rulers have vast resources at their disposal and a burning desire to legitimize their rule and project an image of unassailable might, they tend to turn to artists and builders. It's like a very, very old version of a tech billionaire commissioning a wildly extravagant headquarters. Except instead of glass and steel, it was mud bricks and carved stone. And the purpose wasn't just to impress employees, but to intimidate entire populations into submission. The artistic output of the Akkadian period thus represents a distinctive synthesis, drawing from earlier Sumerian traditions, while forging a bold, new imperial style that emphasized power, naturalism, and often the deified ruler. Before the Akkadian rise, Sumerian art, while highly sophisticated, often focused on religious themes, communal life, and stylized depictions of deities and worshippers. Akkadian art, while still retaining religious elements, shifted its focus significantly towards the glorification of the king and his empire. This was a deliberate choice, serving as a powerful form of propaganda, much like how modern states use grand monuments and official portraits to project an image of authority and national pride. The art was designed to be seen, to be understood, and to convey a clear message. Akkad is powerful, its king is divine, and resistance is futile. One of the most striking characteristics of Akkadian art is its increased naturalism compared to earlier Sumerian styles. While still highly stylized by modern standards, Akkadian artists paid greater attention to anatomical detail, facial expressions, and the dynamic portrayal of movement. You see figures depicted with more rounded, muscular forms, conveying a sense of physical power. Battles scenes, for example, are often rendered with a greater sense of dynamism and chaos, capturing the intensity of conflict, rather than just a static, symbolic representation. This focus on naturalism made the imagery more impactful, more relatable, even if what it depicted was a god-king trampling his enemies, and ultimately, more persuasive. It's the difference between a stick figure drawing of a battle and a detailed comic book panel. One tells a story, the other shows it. The stele of Naram-Sin, which we touched upon earlier, remains the quintessential example of Akkadian imperial art. Beyond its symbolic significance of Naram-Sin's divinity, it showcases the aesthetic achievements of the period. The composition is masterfully done, with figures arranged dynamically, leading the eye upwards towards the triumphant king. The individual soldiers are depicted with a newfound vigor and anatomical accuracy, and the contorted bodies of the defeated Lullaby enemies convey their suffering and utter defeat. The carving itself is of exceptional quality, demonstrating a high level of technical skill in working with hard stone. This stele wasn't just a piece of art. It was a carefully crafted political statement, meant to inspire awe and reinforce the emperor's power, like a very large, very heavy mic drop. Another remarkable artifact is the bronze head of an Akkadian ruler, often attributed to Sargon himself, though this is debated among scholars. This life-sized head is an astonishing piece of metallurgy, showcasing intricate details in the beard and hair, and powerful, piercing eyes, though the inlaid eyes themselves are long gone, probably looted in antiquity. The naturalism of the facial features, combined with the regal majesty of the overall depiction, makes it a captivating portrait. The mere fact that Akkadian artisans were capable of casting such a large and detailed bronze object demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of metalworking techniques, pushing the boundaries of what was technologically possible at the time. It's the kind of piece that, even today, makes you lean in closer, wondering about the person it represents. In terms of architecture, while the specific city of Akkad itself remains elusive, what we know suggests a continuation and expansion of monumental building traditions. Temples and palaces would have been constructed on a grand scale, utilizing the abundant local material, mud bricks. While less durable than stone, these structures would have been imposing and impressive in their time, probably adorned with glazed bricks, murals, and intricate friezes. The Akkadians likely continued the Sumerian tradition of building ziggurats, massive stepped temple towers that served as focal points for urban centers and symbols of civic and religious authority. These colossal structures would have dominated the skyline, visible for miles around, serving as a constant reminder of the empire's power and its connection to the divine. The decorative arts also flourished. Akkadian cylinder seals, small cylindrical stones carved with intricate designs and used to authenticate documents by rolling them onto wet clay, are particularly noteworthy. These seals often depicted mythological scenes, religious rituals, and increasingly scenes of the king battling mythical beasts or performing heroic feats. The craftsmanship on these tiny objects is often breathtaking, demonstrating the skill of Akkadian artists even on a miniature scale. The stories they tell, often heroic and grand, reflect the prevailing imperial ideology and the emphasis on the king's heroic qualities. It's like having tiny, highly detailed action movies on your official paperwork. The artistic and architectural developments of the Akkadian period had a lasting impact on subsequent Mesopotamian civilizations. The emphasis on royal iconography, the increased naturalism, and the grand scale of monumental art influenced later Assyrian and Babylonian artistic traditions. The concept of the heroic king, depicted in art, often battling forces of chaos or standing as an intermediary between humanity and the divine, became a recurring motif that would echo for centuries. Historians still argue whether Akkadian art truly represented a break from Sumerian traditions or a natural evolution. But there's no denying its distinctive character and its powerful role in projecting imperial authority. This cultural flourishing wasn't just about aesthetics. It was deeply intertwined with the empire's political and economic structures. The wealth generated from expanded trade and efficient administration provided the resources for these ambitious artistic and architectural projects. The artists and craftsmen, often working under royal patronage, were an integral part of the imperial machinery, creating visual narratives that reinforced the power and legitimacy of the Akkadian rulers. It was a symbiotic relationship. The empire provided the means, and the art provided the message, solidifying Akkad's place not just as a military giant, but as a cultural innovator that left an indelible mark on the artistic landscape of the ancient Near East. So, while we can't visit the actual city of Akkad, The art it produced speaks volumes about the ambition, power, and surprising artistic sophistication of this pioneering empire. Beyond the imposing steles and the awe-inspiring bronze heads, one of the most significant and enduring legacies of the Akkadian Empire, often overlooked in favor of more dramatic tales of conquest, was the profound impact and widespread adoption of the Akkadian language. This wasn't merely a dialect. It was a distinct Semitic language, different from the Sumerian isolating language that had dominated Mesopotamia for millennia. The rise of Akkad meant the rise of Akkadian, not just as the language of the ruling elite, but as a lingua franca across a vast geographical area, laying the groundwork for its dominance in the Near East for centuries to come. It was like, suddenly, everyone in a region deciding that, for all official purposes, they'd start speaking a slightly different version of what they already knew, just to keep things interesting for future archaeologists. Before Sargon, Sumerian was the primary language of Mesopotamia, used in administration, literature, and religious texts. The Sumerians had, after all, invented cuneiform writing, and their language was the bedrock of Mesopotamian literacy. However, the Akkadians, though adopting the cuneiform script for their own language, brought their tongue to the forefront. As the empire expanded and Akkadian became the language of the central government, the military, and imperial trade, its influence spread rapidly. This wasn't necessarily a forced imposition, but rather a practical necessity and a mark of prestige. If you wanted to get ahead in the empire, to work in the administration, or to engage in high-level commerce, learning Akkadian became increasingly advantageous, much like how English is vital in today's global economy. The dual nature of the empire, with both Sumerian and Akkadian languages in use, led to a fascinating period of bilingualism and linguistic interaction. Scribes, the intellectual backbone of Mesopotamian society, were trained in both languages. They meticulously copied Sumerian literary works, religious hymns, and legal texts, ensuring their preservation for future generations, even as they composed new works in Akkadian. This bilingual environment created a rich intellectual crucible, where Sumerian literary tropes and grammatical structures influenced Akkadian, and vice versa. It was a bit like a cultural mashup, where two distinct musical styles suddenly started influencing each other, leading to some truly unique compositions. This preservation effort by Akkadian scribes is a testament to the respect they held for the older Sumerian tradition, even as their own language gained prominence. Indeed, many Sumerian words were borrowed into Akkadian, especially terms related to religion, administration, and early technology, reflecting the deep cultural roots of Sumerian civilization. Conversely, as Akkadian became more widespread, its vocabulary and grammatical structures started influencing the spoken Sumerian of the time. Though Sumerian eventually faded as a spoken language, becoming primarily a liturgical and scholarly tongue, much like Latin in medieval Europe. This linguistic transition, while gradual, was a monumental shift, marking the beginning of the end for Sumerian as a living language. A slow, gentle sunset for a language that had once been the sole voice of Mesopotamian civilization. The Akkadian language itself was part of the East Semitic branch of the Afro-Asiatic language family, related distantly to languages like Arabic and Hebrew, though its structure and vocabulary are quite distinct due to its early divergence and heavy Sumerian influence. It was written using the cuneiform script, which the Akkadians adapted from Sumerian. This meant that while the spoken language was different, the visual representation on clay tablets remained familiar, easing the transition for scribes and administrators. The cuneiform signs, originally pictographic and ideographic in Sumerian, became increasingly phonetic when used to write Akkadian, representing syllables rather than whole words, making the script more flexible and adaptable for different linguistic structures. The spread of Akkadian was crucial for imperial administration and communication. Imagine trying to run an empire where every region spoke a different language, leading to endless misunderstandings and logistical nightmares. With Akkadian as the imperial language, commands could be issued, taxes could be levied, and legal judgments could be rendered with greater consistency across the vast empire. It facilitated trade, allowing merchants from diverse regions to communicate effectively. It was the ancient world's version of a common operating system, making the whole machine run much more smoothly, at least from the perspective of the central government. The influence of Akkadian extended far beyond the geographical boundaries of the empire itself. As the first major imperial language, it set a precedent. In later periods, particularly during the second millennium BCE, Akkadian would become the diplomatic language of the entire Near East, used in correspondence between kings and states from Egypt to Anatolia and beyond. Even after the Akkadian Empire itself had vanished, the famous Amarna letters, a trove of diplomatic correspondence from the 14th century BCE, are largely written in Akkadian, demonstrating its enduring international status. This widespread adoption meant that even cultures far removed from Mesopotamia had to learn Akkadian to engage in international relations, a testament to the profound and lasting impact of Sargon's original imperial vision. Beyond its practical applications, the Akkadian language also became a vehicle for a new imperial literature. While drawing heavily on Sumerian myths and epics, Akkadian scribes composed their own versions and new narratives that often glorified the king and the empire. Epic poems, royal inscriptions, and administrative texts all served to codify and disseminate the imperial ideology in the dominant language. This body of literature contributed to a shared cultural identity across the empire, even if the adoption was sometimes grudging. It's like how a conquering power often introduces its own national anthem. It might not be everyone's favorite tune, but everyone learns it eventually. Historians still argue whether the imposition of Akkadian language was a benevolent force for unity or another tool of subjugation. However, there's no denying its profound and lasting impact. The Akkadian language endured for over 2 millennia as a written and spoken language in Mesopotamia, evolving into Babylonian and Assyrian dialects, long after the empire that birthed it had crumbled into dust. Its grammatical structures, vocabulary, and literary traditions profoundly shaped the intellectual landscape of the ancient Near East. So, while Sargon built a political empire, he also, perhaps inadvertently, launched a linguistic empire that would outlive his own dynasty by thousands of years, proving that sometimes the pen, or rather the stylus, is indeed mightier than the sword. The Akkadian Empire, for all its military might and administrative ingenuity, faced a constant, insidious threat: internal strife and persistent rebellions. You see, building an empire is one thing. keeping it together when your subjects range from fiercely independent city-states to mountain tribes who've never really liked anyone telling them what to do, is an entirely different kettle of fish. It's like trying to keep a dozen highly opinionated toddlers happy in a single room. Constant vigilance and a very large toy box are required, and even then, tantrums are inevitable. For the Akkadians, these tantrums often came in the form of widespread uprisings that drained the empire's resources and tested the very limits of its endurance. From Sargon's early days, through the reigns of his sons Rimush and Manishtushu, and even into the golden age of Naram-Sin, the empire was plagued by recurrent revolts. These weren't isolated incidents. They were often coordinated uprisings involving multiple Sumerian cities, determined to throw off the Akkadian yoke. The Sumerians, remember, had a long and proud history of independence, with each city-state considering itself a sovereign entity, divinely favored and self-sufficient. The imposition of a centralized Akkadian authority, with its new governors, taxes, and linguistic preferences, was often met with deep-seated resentment. It was a classic clash between imperial ambition and local identity, as history often shows, is a stubborn beast. Sargon himself, despite his legendary military prowess, spent a significant portion of his reign crushing these insurrections. Inscriptions from his time speak of his campaigns to restore order and destroy the rebellious lands, which is a polite way of saying he spent a lot of time reconquering places he had just conquered. The revolt of the city-states, a massive coordinated uprising involving Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and others, forced Sargon to practically re-establish his empire. He responded with overwhelming force, sacking cities, destroying their walls, and sometimes even killing their entire populations, actions that were brutal even by ancient standards, but were clearly intended to send a chilling message. Resistance is not merely futile, it's fatal. These acts of retribution were meant to deter future uprisings, but often they only fueled a deeper, more festering resentment, leading to a vicious cycle of suppression and renewed rebellion. Under his son Rimush, the pattern continued, perhaps even intensified. Sumerian cities like Adab and Zabalam, along with Elamite regions to the east, rose in defiance. Rimush's own inscriptions graphically detail his victories, boasting of massacres and the enslavement of defeated populations. He records battles where tens of thousands were killed or captured, numbers that, while perhaps exaggerated for propaganda purposes, suggest the immense scale and savagery of these conflicts. His short reign was a relentless cycle of military campaigns, hinting at the sheer difficulty of maintaining control over an unwilling populace. It's like constantly having to retie a very slippery knot, knowing it's going to come undone again soon. Even Naram-Sin, the mighty god king, was not immune to this internal instability. While his stele of victory proudly depicts him trampling the lullaby, other inscriptions and later texts indicate that he, too, faced significant internal challenges. The Great Rebellion is one such event where a coalition of Sumerian cities, perhaps seeing his far-flung campaigns as an opportunity, rose up against him. Naram-Sin, despite his divine claims, had to exert immense military effort to put down this widespread revolt. These constant demands on the military meant that even at its peak, the Akkadian Empire was stretched thin, perpetually fighting on multiple fronts both internal and external. The reasons for these persistent rebellions were multifaceted. Firstly, the heavy taxation and tribute demanded by the Akkadian central government would have been a significant burden on the conquered populations. Building and maintaining a vast empire, especially one with a standing army and ambitious building projects, is an expensive business, and the resources had to come from somewhere, usually the pockets and granaries of the subjects. Secondly, the imposition of Akkadian governors and administrators, replacing local elites, would have been deeply resented by the traditional Sumerian aristocracy, who saw their power and prestige eroding. It's like being told, your job is now being done by someone from out of town who doesn't understand your local customs. It's rarely a recipe for harmony. Thirdly, the cultural and religious differences played a role. While the Akkadians adopted aspects of Sumerian culture, and there was a degree of cultural assimilation, the distinct identities and religious practices of the Sumerian city-states remained strong. The explicit deification of Naram-Sin, for example, might have been seen as blasphemous, or at least highly questionable, by traditional Sumerian religious leaders. This clash of cultural and religious identities, combined with political subjugation, fueled a powerful desire for self-determination. The constant need to suppress revolts created a drain on the empire's resources and manpower. It meant that the Akkadian military was almost perpetually engaged in internal policing actions, preventing them from fully focusing on external threats or truly consolidating long-term stability. Each rebellion, even when successfully crushed, cost lives, treasure, and time, weakening the empire's fabric over the long run. It was like constantly having to repair the same leaky pipe. Eventually, the whole plumbing system starts to show strain. This relentless cycle of rebellion and suppression points to a fundamental challenge of early empires: how to govern diverse populations with different histories and loyalties under a centralized authority. The Akkadians, despite their innovations, never fully resolved this tension. Their reliance on military force, while effective in the short term, failed to foster a deep sense of shared imperial identity among many of their subjects. Historians still argue whether a less oppressive approach might have led to greater stability, but given the realities of ancient warfare and governance, it's hard to imagine the Akkadian rulers having many alternative strategies to maintain control over such a sprawling dominion. The empire's success was intertwined with its ability to crush dissent. But this very success also highlighted the underlying fragility of its unity, foreshadowing the eventual decline when the iron fist could no longer strike with sufficient speed or force. As the Akkadian Empire, for all its might, grappled with incessant internal revolts, a new and increasingly formidable threat began to emerge from the mountainous fringes to the east: the Gutian people. You know, it's always the quiet ones, the ones on the periphery, who suddenly decide they want a piece of the pie. While the Akkadians were busy playing whack-a-mole with rebellious Sumerian city-states, these highland tribes were steadily gaining strength, like a snowball rolling downhill, gathering momentum and size until they became an unstoppable avalanche. The Gutians, often described in Mesopotamian texts with a distinct lack of politeness, terms like barbarians, mountain people, and people who know no inhibitions were common, represented a fundamental challenge to the very concept of organized urban civilization that the Akkadians embodied. The Gutians hailed from the Zagros Mountains, a rugged, inaccessible region to the northeast of Mesopotamia, a place where settled agriculture was difficult, and a nomadic or semi-nomadic lifestyle was the norm. Unlike the city-dwelling Sumerians and Akkadians, who lived in well-organized urban centers with complex social structures and elaborate bureaucracies, the Gutians were perceived as less civilized, living in smaller, more decentralized tribal groups. This difference in lifestyle often led to conflict, as mountain peoples frequently raided the fertile plains for resources, a practice as old as the mountains themselves. Imagine living in a well-ordered suburban neighborhood, and then a biker gang from the wilderness decides to crash your block party every other weekend. That was the kind of dynamic at play. Initially, during the reigns of Sargon and Naram-Sin, the Gutians were simply one among many barbarian tribes that the Akkadians campaigned against and subjugated. Naram-Sin famously depicts his victory over the Lulubi, a closely related mountain people, on his stele, showcasing his power over these peripheral threats. However, these victories were often temporary. The Gutians, unlike the settled Sumerians, were difficult to definitively conquer and control. Their mountainous terrain provided natural defenses, and their mobile lifestyle meant they could melt away into the hills, only to reappear later, much like a persistent headache you just can't shake. As the Akkadian Empire stretched its resources battling internal revolts and far-flung campaigns, the Gutian threat began to intensify. Their raids became more frequent, bolder, and more destructive. They weren't just seeking plunder, they were testing the empire's weakening defenses. The constant drain of manpower and wealth from suppressing internal rebellions left the Akkadian military less capable of defending its long and porous eastern frontiers. It's like trying to guard every door and window in a very large house when half your security staff is busy putting out fires in the kitchen. The period following Naram-Sin's reign saw a succession of weaker Akkadian kings. His son, Shah-Kali-Shari, Sati, 2217-193 BCE, inherited an empire already showing signs of strain. He faced continued pressure from both internal rebellions and external invasions, most notably from the Gutians. Inscriptions from his reign speak of his efforts to ward off the Gutian hordes, indicating the increasing severity of their incursions. The poetic lamentation over the destruction of Akkad, a later Sumerian text, vividly describes the Gutians as a people who know no cities, a people of the mountains, portraying them as a destructive force, bringing chaos and famine. While these laments are undoubtedly biased, they capture the Mesopotamian perception of the Gutians as a raw, untamed force of nature, rather than a conventional political power. The Gutian incursions were not a single, decisive invasion, but rather a gradual process of infiltration and increasing dominance. They exploited the empire's internal weaknesses, pushing further into Mesopotamia, disrupting trade, seizing control of agricultural lands, and weakening the central government's authority. The administrative machinery that Sargon had so painstakingly built began to falter under this sustained pressure. Communication broke down, tax revenues dwindled, and the ability to project military force across the empire diminished. It was a slow strangulation rather than a sudden decapitation of the imperial beast. The traditional view, heavily influenced by later Sumerian texts, paints the Gutian period as a dark age, a time of chaos and cultural decline when the royal line of Sumer and Akkad was cast down. These texts describe a breakdown of order, with cities being plundered, temples desecrated, and widespread famine. While modern archaeology suggests this picture might be overly dramatic, some regions seem to have maintained a degree of continuity. There is no doubt that the Gutian incursions marked a significant period of instability and decentralization following the collapse of the unified Akkadian Empire. They were not, it seems, particularly interested in adopting Akkadian administrative practices or establishing their own centralized imperial bureaucracy. Their aim was more about resource extraction and tribal dominance. The very presence of the Gutians underscored a crucial vulnerability of the Akkadian imperial model. Despite their attempts at assimilation and their formidable military, they could not perpetually maintain control over every border and every disaffected group. The sheer scale of the empire, combined with its inherent internal tensions, made it susceptible to persistent external pressure. The Gutians were simply the most effective and relentless of these external pressures, exploiting every crack in the Akkadian foundation until the entire edifice began to crumble. They were like the persistent termites that eventually bring down a mighty oak tree, not with a single blow, but with countless relentless nibbles. And as we will soon see, their presence would usher in a period of Mesopotamian history that fundamentally reshaped the political landscape for centuries to come. As the constant pressure from internal rebellions and the relentless incursions of the Gutians mounted, the mighty edifice of the Akkadian Empire, so meticulously constructed by Sargon and brilliantly expanded by Naram-Sin, began to experience a profound collapse of central authority. This wasn't a sudden cataclysmic event, like a meteorite strike or a particularly ill-advised royal picnic. Rather, it was a gradual unraveling, a slow erosion of power that saw the imperial structure fraying at its edges until it could no longer hold itself together. Imagine a grand tapestry, once vibrant and tightly woven, slowly having its threads pulled out one by one until it's nothing but a tattered mess. The reigns of Naram-Sin's successors, particularly his son Shaka-li-Shari, c. 2217 2993 BCE, marked the beginning of this irreversible decline. Shaka-li-Shari inherited an empire that, while still vast, was increasingly unstable. He spent his reign battling a multi-front war, simultaneously fending off the persistent Gutians from the east, the Amorites from the west, and dealing with renewed widespread rebellions among the Sumerian city-states. It was an impossible task, like trying to juggle 3 flaming chainsaws while riding a unicycle. Something was bound to go wrong. The sheer scale of these challenges stretched the imperial military and administrative resources to their breaking point. The first and perhaps most telling sign of the collapse of central authority was the breakdown of communication and control. The elaborate network of roads and messengers that Sargon had established to bind the empire together began to falter as Gutian raids disrupted routes and local governors became less reliable. The flow of information back to Akkad became sporadic. Without timely intelligence and the ability to issue swift commands, the central government lost its capacity to react effectively to crises, whether they were rebellions or external threats. Imagine trying to run a vast corporation when your emails are delayed by weeks and your regional managers are doing whatever they want. Chaos would ensue, and it did. Concurrently, The economic stability that had fueled the empire's golden age began to erode. Trade routes, once secure under Akkadian military protection, became dangerous due to Gutian raids and local banditry. This disrupted the flow of vital raw materials like copper, tin, and timber, which were essential for the empire's military and construction industries. As trade dwindled, so did the wealth flowing into Akkad's coffers. The ability to collect taxes from distant provinces also diminished, as local authorities either asserted their independence or simply lacked the means to enforce imperial demands amidst the growing chaos. This economic decline created a vicious cycle. Less wealth meant less ability to maintain the army and administration, which in turn led to more instability and further economic decline. Perhaps most critically, the central government's authority over its provinces weakened dramatically. Local rulers and city-states, seeing Akkad's waning power, began to assert their independence once more. Sumerian cities, never truly comfortable under Akkadian rule, stopped sending tribute and manpower, effectively seceding from the empire. Akkadian governors, isolated and without consistent support from the capital, found their positions increasingly untenable, either being overthrown by local populations or themselves declaring de facto independence. This fragmentation was a return to the pre-Sargonic era of independent city-states, but now with the added burden of widespread instability and economic hardship. The grand unified vision dissolved into a patchwork of competing, struggling entities. The period immediately following Shah Kali-Shari's death is particularly murky, often referred to as a time of anarchy or interregnum. Later king lists even state who was king, who was not king, indicating a period of rapid succession and disputed claims to the throne, where no single ruler could firmly establish control over the entire empire. This suggests intense internal power struggles, possibly even civil wars, further weakening Akkad's ability to resist external pressures. When the head of the snake is chopped off, or in this case, constantly being contested, the body tends to flail wildly. The Gutian presence in Mesopotamia grew increasingly bold during this period of central collapse. They were no longer just raiders. They were becoming a dominant force, establishing their own presence in parts of Mesopotamia. While they did not establish a centralized empire in the Akkadian style, their control over key routes and agricultural lands had a devastating impact on the region. The collapse of the Akkadian administrative system meant that the elaborate irrigation networks, so vital for agricultural productivity, likely fell into disrepair in many areas, leading to reduced harvests and widespread famine, further exacerbating the suffering of the populace. This period is often characterized in later texts as a time of misrule and darkness, reflecting the profound disruption it caused to Mesopotamian society. The fall of Akkad wasn't a military defeat in a single decisive battle, but rather the cumulative effect of exhaustion, overextension, and internal fragmentation. The empire simply could no longer effectively govern its vast territories, feed its population, or defend itself against relentless external and internal pressures. The centralized bureaucracy, once its strength, became a burden it could no longer sustain. The very concept of a unified empire, pioneered by Sargon, seemed to collapse under its own weight, proving that even the most innovative and powerful political structures have their limits, especially when constantly under siege. And with the collapse of Akkad's central authority, Mesopotamia entered a new, uncertain chapter, one marked by fragmentation and the dominance of unfamiliar faces from the mountains. While the internal strife and the Gutian incursions were undoubtedly major factors in the demise of the Akkadian Empire, a fascinating and increasingly compelling theory suggests that the final decisive blow may have come not from human adversaries, but from the very environment itself. This theory, gaining traction among scholars, posits that climate change, specifically a prolonged and severe drought, played a significant, perhaps even pivotal, role in the empire's ultimate collapse. It's a reminder that even the most powerful empires are ultimately beholden to the whims of Mother Nature, a force more formidable than any army, and certainly less amenable to negotiation. The premise of the environmental hypothesis rests on accumulating paleoclimate evidence, derived from studying ancient dust layers, ocean sediments, and stalactites in caves across the region. These scientific investigations paint a picture of a dramatic and sudden climatic shift around 2200 BCE, precisely when the Akkadian Empire was in its death throes. This evidence suggests a period of intense and prolonged drought, lasting perhaps for several decades, or even up to a century, affecting a wide swath of the Near East, from Anatolia to the Indus Valley. Imagine a severe drought today, impacting major agricultural regions. The economic and social consequences would be catastrophic, and in the ancient world, with far less resilience, they would have been utterly devastating. For Mesopotamia, a civilization entirely dependent on irrigated agriculture, sustained by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a severe drought would have been a death knell. Lower rainfall in the Anatolian highlands, where the rivers originate, would have led to significantly reduced river flow. This, in turn, would have crippled the elaborate irrigation systems that were the lifeblood of Akkadian agriculture. Fields would have dried up, crops would have failed, and the once fertile plains would have transformed into parched, unproductive land. A few bad harvests are one thing, but a sustained period of crop failure would have led to widespread famine, social unrest, and mass displacement. It's like turning off the main power supply to a complex machine. Everything grinds to a halt, then breaks down. The consequences of such a drought would have rippled through every aspect of the empire. Firstly, food scarcity would have led to widespread starvation among the general populace. Even if the central government had grain reserves, distributing them across a vast drought-stricken empire with faltering administrative control would have been an insurmountable challenge. The social fabric would have frayed as people desperate for food turned to raiding, internal migration, or outright rebellion against a government perceived as unable to protect them from famine. This could have exacerbated the existing internal strife, turning localized discontent into a full-blown crisis of survival. Secondly, the economic impact would have been catastrophic. A collapse in agricultural output would have meant a drastic reduction in tax revenues, further crippling the central government's ability to maintain its army, its bureaucracy, and its public works. The long-distance trade networks, which relied on stable conditions and surplus production, would have been severely disrupted as regions struggled to feed themselves, let alone produce goods for export. Without vital raw materials, the empire's industries, particularly its metalworking for tools and weapons, would have ground to a halt. Imagine an economy collapsing because its primary industry, literally farming, just ceased to function. Thirdly, climate change could have directly contributed to the Gutian invasions. As their own mountainous homelands became drier and less hospitable, the Gutians would have been driven by sheer necessity to seek out more fertile lands. The lush plains of Mesopotamia, even if drought-stricken, would have still offered better prospects for survival than their desiccated mountains. Thus, the relentless Gutian incursions might not have been solely motivated by military ambition, but by an existential need for food and water, turning them into a desperate migrating force, which is often far more dangerous than a purely conquering army. Their relentless push into Mesopotamia could be seen as an ancient climate migration, driven by environmental catastrophe in their own lands. While the evidence for this climate event is strong, its exact role in the Akkadian collapse remains a subject of scholarly debate. Some historians argue that while climate change certainly exacerbated the empire's problems, it was not the sole cause, and that existing internal weaknesses, such as overextension, administrative inefficiencies, and constant rebellions, had already predisposed the empire to collapse. Others emphasize the primacy of the environmental factor, suggesting that even a perfectly healthy empire would have struggled to survive such a severe and prolonged climatic shock. It's a classic chicken or egg scenario. Did the empire crumble because it was already weak? Or did the drought make it weak enough to crumble? Nevertheless, the climate change hypothesis offers a powerful lens through which to view the end of the Akkadian Empire. It adds a layer of tragic inevitability to the narrative, suggesting that even the most innovative and powerful human endeavors can be undone by forces beyond their control. It highlights the vulnerability of early civilizations, tightly coupled to their natural environments, and serves as a sobering reminder of the profound impact that environmental shifts can have on human societies, even today. The echoes of a parched land, once fertile, and a once mighty empire brought to its knees by the absence of rain resonate through the millennia, reminding us that nature ultimately bats last. As the Akkadian Empire was increasingly destabilized by internal strife and quite possibly by a punishing climate shift, the relentless pressure from the Gutians finally pushed Mesopotamia into a new, rather grim chapter. This wasn't a formal surrender ceremony with flags and peace treaties, but rather a gradual, violent incursion that saw the mountain people seize control over significant parts of the Mesopotamian heartland. It was less like a conquest and more like a pervasive infestation, slowly but surely taking over the house as the original owners grew too weak to defend it. The Gutian presence in Mesopotamia was not characterized by the establishment of a centralized, organized empire like the Akkadians before them. Instead, it was more akin to a period of tribal dominance and fragmented rule. They were not empire builders in the Akkadian mold. Rather, they were plunderers and opportunistic rulers, content to extract resources and exert localized control without investing in the complex administrative structures that characterized Mesopotamian civilization. Imagine a group of very effective raiders who suddenly find themselves in charge of a sophisticated urban system, only to shrug and say, "Nah, we're good. Just give us the shiny bits and the grain." The precise timeline and extent of Gutian rule are still debated by scholars, often referred to as the Gutian interregnum, or Gutian period, roughly late 22nd to late 21st century BCE. Their control was likely strongest in the northern parts of Mesopotamia, near Akkad itself, and less pervasive in the south, where some Sumerian city-states managed to maintain a degree of autonomy, or at least suffer less direct Gutian oversight. The later Sumerian king list, a historical document with a strong anti-Gutian bias, portrays them as a long line of unremarkable kings who ruled for short, chaotic periods, often failing to maintain order or build anything lasting. This negative portrayal paints a picture of societal decay and misrule under the Gutians, largely due to their perceived lack of civilized governance. Archaeological evidence, while not always as dramatic as the king list, generally supports the notion of widespread disruption. There's a noticeable decline in monumental construction during this period, particularly in the north. Large-scale public works, like the maintenance of vast irrigation systems, likely suffered due to the absence of a strong central authority. This neglect would have contributed to agricultural decline and further exacerbated food shortages, creating a vicious cycle of instability and scarcity. Imagine a previously thriving city where the roads aren't repaired, the public services dwindle, and everyone just kind of fends for themselves. That seems to have been the Gutian impact on many areas. One of the most immediate and profound impacts of the Gutian incursion was the disruption of trade and communication. The intricate networks that the Akkadians had built to connect their empire and supply it with vital raw materials largely broke down. Raids on caravans and river traffic would have made long-distance commerce incredibly risky, leading to economic contraction. Without the central government to enforce security and maintain infrastructure, regional isolation increased, further fragmenting the already struggling economy. This lack of secure trade meant a shortage of metals for tools and weapons, a decline in luxury goods for the elite, and a general impoverishment across the land. Culturally, the Gutian period is often seen as a step backward. The sophisticated Akkadian artistic traditions and the flourishing of literature seem to have waned in the northern territories under Gutian influence. While some local traditions persisted, the grand imperial style and the focus on monumental propaganda largely disappeared. The Gutians did not impose their own language or culture in the way the Akkadians had attempted. Rather, their impact was more destructive and extractive. They simply took what they wanted and left the rest to decline, without much interest in fostering cultural development. It's like having a notoriously uncultured landlord who just wants the rent and doesn't care if the roof leaks or the paint peels. However, it's important to remember that the Gutian impact wasn't uniformly devastating across all of Mesopotamia. In the southern Sumerian heartland, some city-states, like Lagash and Ur, managed to regain a degree of independence and even experienced periods of local resurgence during this time. The famous ruler Gudea of Lagash, for instance, lived during the Gutian period and is known for his numerous exquisitely carved diorite statues and his extensive temple-building programs. This suggests that while the north suffered greatly, the south was able to rebuild and even thrive locally, capitalizing on the absence of a strong central imperial power. This highlights the uneven nature of Gutian control. They might have held sway in one region, but been largely irrelevant in another. The Gutian presence also led to a significant loss of institutional memory and bureaucratic efficiency that the Akkadians had painstakingly built. Without a centralized administration to maintain records, collect taxes systematically, and oversee large-scale projects, much of the sophisticated infrastructure began to crumble. The era is sometimes described as a dark age, not just due to chaos, but because our historical record for this period is often sparse, reflecting the disruption in scribal activities and record-keeping that characterized a less organized ruling power. Ultimately, the Gutian incursion represented the culmination of the Akkadian Empire's decline. They were the force that finally broke the back of the centralized state, not necessarily by conquering it in a single battle, but by exploiting its pre-existing weaknesses, disrupting its vital systems, and preventing any effective resurgence of a unified authority. Their period of dominance, though often viewed negatively, played a crucial role in reshaping the political landscape of Mesopotamia, creating a vacuum that would eventually lead to the rise of new powers, but not before a period of profound uncertainty, and for many, considerable hardship. And for a civilization built on the principles of order and control, the Gutian period must have felt like a very long, very unsettling night. The period following the collapse of the Akkadian Empire and the subsequent Gutian incursion is often depicted in later Mesopotamian literature as a time of unmitigated chaos and cultural decline, a sort of ancient dark ages where the lights of civilization dimmed considerably. While this portrayal might be overly dramatic in its sweeping generalizations, because let's be honest, ancient scribes, much like modern pundits, sometimes enjoyed a bit of hyperbole. There's no denying that life under Gutian rule was profoundly different, and for many, significantly harsher than under the more organized Akkadian administration. Imagine trading a well-oiled machine for a collection of rusty parts, and you get a sense of the shift. One of the most immediate impacts on daily life was the breakdown of law and order. The centralized legal system and imperial enforcement that the Akkadians had established largely disintegrated. Without a strong central authority to maintain security, local banditry and intercity squabbles likely increased. For the average person, this meant less personal safety, less protection for their property, and a general atmosphere of unpredictability. Trade routes became perilous, making it difficult for merchants to conduct business and for goods to flow freely. This would have led to shortages of various commodities, particularly raw materials that Mesopotamia lacked, causing prices to skyrocket for basic necessities and luxury items alike. It's a bit like living in a town where the police force has just vanished and the grocery store shelves are perpetually empty. Agriculture, the backbone of Mesopotamian society, also suffered significantly. The vast, intricate irrigation systems that fed the plains required constant maintenance and coordinated management, tasks that the Akkadian central government had overseen. Under the fragmented and less organized Gutian rule, these vital canals and dams likely fell into disrepair in many regions. Without proper irrigation, crop yields would have plummeted, leading to widespread food shortages and famine. Later texts lament that grain prices became exorbitant, and people were forced to eat wild plants, a clear sign of severe hardship. This agricultural decline would have had a cascading effect, leading to population displacement, increased poverty, and further social instability. Nobody wants to deal with a hungry population, especially when there's no functioning government to even try and help. Culturally, the Gutian period is characterized by a perceived lack of monumental artistic and architectural output, particularly in the regions directly under their control. While the Akkadians had built impressive ziggurats, temples, and palaces, the Gutians showed little interest in such grand projects. This meant a decline in royal patronage for scribes, artists, and craftsmen, leading to a potential loss of skills and a shift away from the grand imperial style. Sumerian religious practices and literary traditions, while not entirely extinguished, likely persisted more at a local level, with less centralized oversight or widespread dissemination. It was a time when the focus shifted from grand imperial statements to mere survival, and building magnificent temples perhaps took a backseat to finding enough food for your family. The very nature of Gutian governance was also a radical departure. Unlike the bureaucratic Akkadians, the Gutians were a confederation of tribes. Their kings, as listed in the king list, often ruled for very short periods, suggesting internal instability and a lack of consolidated power. They did not implement a sophisticated tax system or a complex administrative hierarchy. Their rule was more about episodic extraction of tribute and maintaining a loose, often brutal, dominance over the conquered territories, rather than establishing a coherent, long-term governing structure. This informal, less centralized approach to power meant less predictable rule and more localized decision-making, which could swing wildly between tolerable and utterly oppressive, depending on the local Gutian chieftain. However, it's crucial to add a nuance to this grim picture. The Gutian impact was not uniform across all of Mesopotamia. While northern Akkad likely suffered greatly, archaeological evidence suggests that some southern Sumerian cities experienced a degree of resurgence during this period. Cities like Lagash, under rulers like Gudea, managed to maintain a remarkable level of prosperity and cultural activity. Gudea, known for his pious devotion to the gods and his extensive temple building, commissioned numerous exquisitely carved statues of himself and engaged in long-distance trade to acquire exotic materials for his constructions. This suggests that while Gutian control crippled the imperial center, it also allowed some southern city-states to reassert their independence and flourish locally, freed from Akkadian dominance. These southern enclaves essentially carved out their own spheres of influence, like small islands of relative calm in a stormy sea. This regional variation means that while the Gutian Dark Age narrative holds true for much of the former Akkadian heartland, it doesn't paint the complete picture for the entire Mesopotamian landscape. In the south, the enduring Sumerian traditions found new life, albeit on a smaller city-state scale. The resilience of Sumerian culture, having weathered centuries of internal conflicts and now Akkadian rule, allowed it to rebound in the absence of a strong unifying power. This period saw a renewed focus on Sumerian language, literature, and religious practices in these southern cities, almost a defensive cultural stance against the barbarian invaders. In essence, life under Gutian rule was characterized by fragmentation, instability, and a decline in centralized authority, leading to widespread hardship in many areas. The grand unified vision of the Akkadian Empire was replaced by a more localized, often chaotic, political landscape. While later accounts undeniably exaggerate the misery, They reflect a deep-seated Mesopotamian antipathy towards these foreigners who brought not order, but disruption. The Gutian period, for all its perceived darkness, was a crucial transitional phase, an uncomfortable but necessary interval that cleared the stage for the next great act in Mesopotamian history, proving that even a perceived step backward can sometimes be a prelude to a new and different kind of progress. The fall of the Akkadian Empire, culminating in the Gutian incursion and the subsequent period of fragmented rule, left a profound and multifaceted legacy on Mesopotamia. It wasn't just the end of a dynasty, it was the end of the world's first true empire. A monumental shift that fundamentally reshaped the political, social, and cultural landscape for centuries to come. Imagine the immediate aftermath of a global superpower collapsing. The ripple effects would be felt everywhere, creating power vacuums and forcing everyone to rethink the established order. And for Mesopotamia, this was exactly that kind of seismic event. Perhaps the most immediate and tangible legacy was the political fragmentation of Mesopotamia. The unified empire, which had brought a vast territory under a single administration, dissolved into a patchwork of independent city-states. This was, in many ways, a return to the pre-Sargonic era, but with a crucial difference. The memory of empire, of a unified realm, now existed, while some Sumerian cities in the south, like Lagash and Ur, managed to regain a significant degree of autonomy and even experienced local renaissances. The overall picture was one of decentralization. This period of city-state resurgence, often termed the Neo-Sumerian period, saw a renewed emphasis on Sumerian cultural and linguistic traditions, almost as a reaction against the preceding Akkadian dominance and the subsequent Gutian barbarism. It was a declaration of cultural resilience, a fervent effort to reclaim and reinvigorate their ancient heritage, much like a proud nation reasserting its identity after a period of foreign occupation. Economically, the collapse of the central authority had a devastating impact on the elaborate trade networks that the Akkadians had established. The long-distance roads, once secured by imperial might, became dangerous and unreliable under fragmented Gutian control. This disruption led to severe economic contraction in many areas, particularly the former Akkadian heartland. Shortages of vital raw materials, a decline in agricultural output due to neglected irrigation systems, and widespread famine became hallmarks of this period for many communities. While some southern cities managed to maintain local trade and prosperity, the grand imperial economy that had connected Mesopotamia to distant lands like the Indus Valley largely vanished, leaving behind a more localized and often precarious economic landscape. Culturally, the legacy was a mix of loss and transformation. The unique Akkadian artistic style, with its emphasis on royal glorification and naturalism, diminished in prominence, though its influence would subtly persist in later Mesopotamian art. The elaborate administrative and scribal traditions that characterized the Akkadian bureaucracy also suffered a significant blow, leading to a period of less systematic record-keeping and a decline in monumental inscriptions in the former imperial center. However, the Sumerian language and literature, which had been overshadowed by Akkadian during the empire, experienced a powerful revival in the south. Scribes in cities like Ur and Lagash meticulously copied and preserved ancient Sumerian texts, composed new hymns, and laments, and reaffirmed the Sumerian literary canon. This cultural renaissance in the south would lay the groundwork for the impressive Third Dynasty of Ur, a period known for its sophisticated administration and renewed Sumerian cultural dominance. Perhaps one of the most intriguing aspects of Akkad's legacy is the memory of empire itself. Even in its destruction, the Akkadian Empire provided a powerful template for future rulers. The concept of a vast, centrally governed state, ruling over diverse peoples, was now a tangible reality, not just an abstract idea. Later, Mesopotamian kings, from the rulers of the Ur-III dynasty to the old Babylonian kings like Hammurabi and the mighty Assyrian emperors, would consciously look back to Sargon and Naram-Sin as their predecessors and role models. They would adopt the title King of the Four Quarters, seek to emulate Akkadian administrative practices, and draw inspiration from Akkadian military tactics and imperial ideology. The Akkadians, despite their eventual failure, had shown that a unified, powerful state across Mesopotamia was not only possible, but, for ambitious rulers, desirable. It was like setting a new high score in a video game. Everyone else would then try to beat it. The very notion of the Curse of Akkad, a later Sumerian literary text, speaks volumes about the lingering impact of its fall. This text attributes the empire's collapse to Naram-Sin's hubris and his desecration of the god Enlil's temple in Nippur, leading to divine retribution. While a mythological explanation, it reflects a historical anxiety about the consequences of imperial overreach and disrespect for traditional religious norms. This narrative, passed down through generations, served as a cautionary tale, but also implicitly acknowledged the grandeur of the empire that had fallen. In essence, the end of the Akkadian Empire was not a neat closure, but a messy, transformative period. It was a time of hardship and political vacuum, but also one of cultural resilience and the reassertion of local identities. More importantly, it established the blueprint for empire in the ancient Near East. Subsequent rulers would learn from Akkad's successes and failures, striving to achieve its level of power and unity, while perhaps trying to avoid its ultimate fate. The shadow of Akkad, the world's first imperial experiment, would loom large over Mesopotamian history, a powerful reminder of both the intoxicating allure and the inherent fragility of centralized power. The dust of Akkad's downfall would settle, but its ideas, like faint echoes, would persist, shaping the empires that followed, proving that even in ruins, a great idea can still inspire. From the ashes of the fragmented Akkadian Empire and the period of Gutian dominance, a new power began to coalesce in the southern Mesopotamian plains, marking a remarkable Sumerian revival. This wasn't a sudden burst, but a gradual reassertion of authority by the ancient Sumerian city-states, who, even during the darkest days of Gutian rule, had often managed to retain a degree of cultural and political integrity. It was like an ancient cultural pendulum swinging back, reminding everyone that while empires might rise and fall, deep-rooted traditions can endure, much like a stubborn weed in a meticulously maintained garden. This period, often referred to as the Neo-Sumerian Renaissance, or more specifically, the Third Dynasty of Ur, Ur-III, began to emerge towards the very end of the Gutian period. While the Gutians had managed to cripple the Akkadian imperial structure, their grip on southern Mesopotamia was never as absolute or as organized as the Akkadians. This allowed several Sumerian cities to maintain their unique cultural identity and even begin to rebuild their local power bases. The most notable of these resurgent cities was Uruk, where a king named Utu-Hegal Sayui 2119-2113 BCE emerged as a key figure in challenging Gutian authority. Utu-Hegal is credited with finally expelling the Gutians from Mesopotamia, an event often celebrated in later Sumerian literature as a liberation from the dragon of the mountains. His victory over the last Gutian king, Tirigan, was a watershed moment, symbolizing the end of the chaotic Gutian interregnum and the re-establishment of native Mesopotamian rule. It's like the moment in a superhero movie when the unlikely hero finally defeats the big bad villain, and everyone can breathe a collective sigh of relief, though probably with a lot more mud and less spandex. This expulsion didn't mean that all problems vanished overnight, but it removed the primary external obstacle to renewed Mesopotamian consolidation. Following Utu-Hegal, his son-in-law, Ur-Nammu, the founder of the third dynasty of Ur, rose to prominence, c. 2112-2095 BCE. Ur-Nammu was a truly remarkable figure, often seen as a spiritual successor to Sargon in his ambition and administrative prowess, but with a distinctly Sumerian, cultural bent. He systematically re-established centralized authority, though initially on a more regional scale, gradually expanding the influence of Ur across Sumer and Akkad. His reign marked the beginning of a period of peace, prosperity, and order after decades of chaos. He was essentially the cleanup crew after a very messy party, and he did an excellent job of restoring normalcy. The Ur-III state was a highly centralized bureaucracy, perhaps even more so than the Akkadian Empire at its peak. Ur-Nammu and his successors developed an incredibly sophisticated administrative system, relying on meticulous record-keeping on clay tablets. Tens of thousands of these administrative tablets, detailing everything from grain disbursements to livestock counts and labor assignments, have been unearthed by archaeologists, providing an unparalleled insight into the daily workings of this highly organized state. This bureaucratic precision was crucial for managing a vast agricultural economy, collecting taxes efficiently, and funding ambitious building projects. It was a true triumph of ancient data management, proving that even without computers, you can organize an awful lot of information if you have enough scribes and clay. Under Ur-Nammu, there was a profound cultural renaissance of Sumerian traditions. The Sumerian language, which had been in decline as a spoken tongue, was vigorously revived as the official language of the state, used in administration, law, and literature. Royal inscriptions were once again written in Sumerian. Monumental hymns to Sumerian gods were composed, and ancient Sumerian myths and epics were copied and preserved. This was a deliberate effort to reaffirm Sumerian identity and pride after the period of Akkadian and Gutian dominance. It was a conscious return to their roots, a celebration of their unique heritage, and a powerful statement of cultural resilience. Ur-Nammu is also famous for issuing one of the earliest known law codes in human history, predating Hammurabi's famous code by several centuries. While only fragments survive, the Code of Ur-Nammu outlines legal principles, punishments for various offenses, and regulations concerning property, family, and commerce. This law code reflects a desire to establish justice, order, and predictability throughout the realm, a stark contrast to the perceived chaos of the Gutian period. It demonstrated a commitment to fair governance and provided a clear framework for societal norms, basically an ancient rule book for how to not get into trouble, or at least how to get out of it gracefully. Architecturally, the Ur-Threed period saw a resurgence of monumental building. Ur-Nammu initiated the construction of the Great Ziggurat of Ur, a massive stepped pyramid dedicated to the moon god Nana, which remains one of the best preserved ziggurats in Mesopotamia. This impressive structure, along with other temples and public works, symbolized the renewed prosperity and religious piety of the Ur-Threed dynasty. It was a tangible declaration that Sumerian civilization was back, bigger and better than ever, and was willing to invest heavily in projecting that image. The Sumerian revival under the Ur-Threed dynasty was a testament to the enduring power and adaptability of Sumerian culture. Despite suffering through periods of foreign rule and internal strife, their traditions, their language, and their administrative genius found a way to reassert themselves. This period, while relatively short-lived compared to the Akkadian Empire, nevertheless represented a golden age of Sumerian civilization. A final, brilliant flourish before Sumerian ceased to be a spoken language entirely. It showed that even after an empire falls, the seeds of civilization can endure and blossom again, sometimes in familiar forms, sometimes in surprising new ones. Even though the Akkadian Empire itself had faded from power, supplanted first by the Gutian interregnum, and then by the resurgence of Sumerian city-states under the third dynasty of Ur, its shadow loomed large over subsequent Mesopotamian history. The enduring Akkadian influence was profound, shaping everything from political ideology and administrative practices to language, art, and even the very concept of empire for centuries to come. It's like how an old, beloved classic novel might go out of print, but its themes and characters continue to inspire countless new stories and adaptations. The original might be gone, but its spirit lives on. Perhaps the most significant legacy was the blueprint for empire that Sargon and his successors had created. Before Akkad, Mesopotamian political entities were primarily city-states, sometimes forming temporary hegemonies, but rarely achieving sustained centralized control over vast territories. The Akkadians demonstrated that it was possible to unify disparate regions, diverse populations, and different cultures under a single overarching authority. This revolutionary concept, the very idea of a multi-ethnic, multilingual empire, became the aspirational goal for nearly every ambitious Mesopotamian ruler who followed. From the kings of the Ur-Threed dynasty to the powerful old Babylonian rulers like Hammurabi, and especially the mighty Neo-Assyrian emperors, they all looked back to Akkad as the original model, the first grand experiment in universal dominion. This emulation wasn't just theoretical, it was practical. Future rulers adopted and adapted Akkadian administrative practices, the highly centralized bureaucracy, the system of appointing loyal governors, the standardization of weights and measures, and the emphasis on meticulous record-keeping. All these innovations, pioneered by Akkad, were either directly adopted or heavily influenced the administrative structures of later Mesopotamian states. The Ur-Threed period, for instance, which was Sumerian in language and cultural emphasis, nevertheless implemented an administrative system that was in many ways even more centralized and efficient than Akkad's, building directly on the Akkadian model of imperial governance. It was as if Akkad had written the first operating system, and everyone else just kept releasing updated versions, improving on the original code. Linguistically, the Akkadian Empire left an undeniable and colossal mark. While Sumerian experienced a revival under Ur-the-Third, it was largely a conscious, scholarly effort to preserve a dying language. Akkadian, on the other hand, continued to thrive and evolve as a spoken language. It branched into distinct dialects, most notably Babylonian in the south and Assyrian in the north, which would become the dominant languages of Mesopotamia for the next 2 millennia. The cuneiform script, adapted by the Akkadians for their language, became the standard writing system across the Near East, used to write not just Akkadian, but also Hurrian, Hittite, and Ugaritic, among others. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence from the 14th century BCE, written between the Egyptian pharaohs and various Near Eastern rulers, are a prime example of Akkadian's enduring status as the lingua franca of international diplomacy. This linguistic legacy outlived the empire itself by vast stretches of time, proving that language can be a more tenacious conqueror than any army. In the realm of royal ideology and iconography, the Akkadians set precedents that resonated for centuries. Sargon's title, King of the Four Quarters of the World, became a standard claim for later Mesopotamian rulers seeking to assert universal dominion. Naram-Sin's unprecedented claim to divinity was also influential, even if few later kings explicitly deified themselves to the same extent. The concept of the king as a divinely sanctioned or divinely favored figure, intimately connected to the gods and responsible for the welfare of the land, was deeply embedded in Akkadian royal ideology and continued to shape the self-presentation of subsequent rulers. The artistic representation of the heroic, powerful king, often seen smiting enemies or communing with deities, derived much from Akkadian prototypes like the stele of Naram-Sin. Even the memory of Akkad's fall had a lasting impact. The narrative of its collapse, often attributed to divine wrath against Naram-Sin's hubris, as seen in the Curse of Akkad text, served as a powerful cautionary tale for later rulers. It instilled a sense of caution about overreaching ambition and the importance of maintaining proper religious piety, even as they sought to emulate Akkad's power. This moralistic interpretation of Akkad's demise became a recurring theme in Mesopotamian historical and literary traditions, a constant reminder that even the greatest can fall. Historians still argue whether this narrative helped prevent similar imperial overreach, or simply served as a convenient way to explain inevitable decline. But its presence confirms Akkad's enduring cultural footprint. Furthermore, the cultural synthesis that began under the Akkadians, the blending of Sumerian and Akkadian elements, continued to evolve, creating a richer, more complex Mesopotamian civilization. While the Ur-3 period saw a Sumerian resurgence, the underlying cultural foundations had been irrevocably altered by the Akkadian interlude. This ongoing cultural exchange and integration meant that subsequent Mesopotamian cultures, such as the Old Babylonian and Old Assyrian periods, were inheritors of a composite legacy, drawing from both Sumerian and Akkadian roots. It was a cultural melting pot, with the Akkadian contribution being a very distinct and flavorful ingredient. In summary, the Akkadian Empire, despite its relatively short lifespan as a unified entity was a true game-changer. It was the trailblazer, the first significant imperial experiment in human history, proving that large-scale, centralized governance was possible. Its innovations in administration, its linguistic dominance, its unique artistic style, and its very ideological concepts of kingship and empire cast a long shadow over the millennia that followed. The empires that rose and fell in Mesopotamia after Akkad were, in many ways, standing on the shoulders of this forgotten giant, trying to recapture its glory and learn from its mistakes. The dust may have claimed its cities, but the influence of Akkad proved to be remarkably resilient, weaving itself into the very fabric of Mesopotamian civilization, an unseen thread that connected the past to the future. For many centuries, the Akkadian Empire was, for all intents and purposes, a lost chapter of history, little more than a whisper in ancient texts and a few fleeting references in later king lists. Its very existence and the grandeur it once held remained largely shrouded in the sands of time, a ghost of an empire waiting to be rediscovered. It was only through the tireless work of archaeologists, sifting through layers of earth and deciphering long-dead languages, that the incredible story of Akkad and its pioneering rulers began to emerge. The tale of its archaeological discoveries is almost as fascinating as the empire itself. A detective story played out across millennia, usually involving a lot of dirt and a surprising amount of broken pottery. The initial clues to Akkad's existence came from Mesopotamian king lists and later historical texts, primarily those written in Sumerian and Babylonian. These documents, meticulously compiled by ancient scribes, spoke of a powerful dynasty that unified Sumer and Akkad, listing the names of Sargon, Rimush, Manishtushu, and Naram-Sin. However, these were often highly stylized accounts, mixing historical fact with legendary embellishment, making it difficult for early scholars to distinguish reality from myth. It was like trying to piece together a family history from only the most flattering holiday letters. You know there's a kernel of truth, but you're missing all the messy details. The true breakthrough came with the decipherment of cuneiform script in the 19th century. As scholars like Henry Rawlinson unlocked the secrets of the ancient Mesopotamian wedge-shaped writing, a flood of new information became accessible. Tablets unearthed from various sites, initially from later periods, began to reveal more about the Akkadian language, its literature, and its historical figures. Early excavations at major Sumerian cities like Ur, Uruk, and Lagash also yielded Akkadian inscriptions and artifacts, suggesting a period of widespread Akkadian influence. However, the most frustrating puzzle remained the location of Akkad itself. Despite extensive archaeological surveys and excavations across Mesopotamia, the actual capital city, the heart of Sargon's empire, has never been definitively found. This enduring mystery has led to countless theories, with proposed sites ranging from locations near modern Baghdad to others closer to ancient Sippar. Some scholars speculate it lies beneath later larger cities, or perhaps its remains were simply washed away by the shifting Tigris and Euphrates rivers over millennia. Imagine trying to find the original capital of an ancient empire, only to discover it's been buried under a modern airport, or perhaps simply dissolved into the landscape. This elusive nature only adds to Akkad's mystique, making it feel less like a tangible place and more like a legend. Despite the missing capital, significant Akkadian artifacts have been discovered at numerous other sites, allowing archaeologists to piece together a remarkably detailed picture of the empire. One of the most iconic finds was the stele of Naram-Sin, discovered in 1898 in Susa, Elam, modern Iran, where it was taken as plunder by an Elamite king centuries after Akkad's fall. This magnificent monument, now in the Louvre Museum, provided invaluable visual and textual evidence of Naram-Sin's deified status, his military campaigns, and the distinctive Akkadian artistic style. Its discovery was a monumental moment, like finding a long-lost royal portrait that suddenly puts a face to a name you only knew from dusty old books. Another crucial discovery was the bronze head of an Akkadian ruler, found at Nineveh in modern Iraq in 1931, though its attribution to Sargon remains debated. This exquisitely crafted sculpture, despite being intentionally defaced in antiquity, perhaps by later conquerors, showcases the advanced metallurgical skills of the Akkadians and their unique artistic naturalism. It offered a tangible glimpse into the imperial majesty of the Akkadian dynasty, a face from the distant past staring back at us. Thousands of Akkadian cuneiform tablets have been excavated from various sites across Mesopotamia, providing an astonishing wealth of information. These include administrative records detailing the workings of the imperial bureaucracy, economic texts outlining trade and land transactions, royal inscriptions boasting of conquests and building projects, and literary texts, including myths, epics, and wisdom literature, many of which adapted or translated from Sumerian originals. These tablets are the primary source of our knowledge about the Akkadian language, culture, society, and history. Every new tablet deciphered is like finding another page from a lost manuscript, slowly filling in the blanks of a forgotten story. The careful stratigraphic excavation of sites also allowed archaeologists to identify distinct Akkadian levels of occupation, characterized by specific pottery styles, architectural techniques, and artifact types that differentiate them from earlier Sumerian or later periods. This archaeological layering helps confirm the chronological sequence of events described in the ancient texts, providing a tangible timeline to the rise and fall of Akkad. The study of Akkadian archaeology is an ongoing process. Modern techniques, including satellite imagery and advanced geological surveys, are being employed to try and pinpoint the elusive location of Akkad. Researchers continue to analyze existing collections of tablets and artifacts, extracting new insights from old data, while new excavations in less explored regions might still yield revolutionary discoveries. Historians still argue whether the lack of Akkad's definitive location is a sign of its sudden destruction, or simply the result of geological processes. But its absence only heightens the allure of this groundbreaking empire. In essence, the archaeological discovery of the Akkadian Empire has been a triumph of persistence, intellect, and sheer luck. It's a testament to the power of scientific inquiry to resurrect entire civilizations from the dustbin of history, transforming legendary figures into tangible historical actors, and revealing the true depth and complexity of ancient Mesopotamian civilization. The silent stones and cracked clay tablets, once buried and forgotten, now speak volumes, telling the incredible story of the world's first empire and its enduring impact. As we draw closer to the conclusion of our nocturnal journey through the Akkadian Empire, It's worth pausing to consider the overarching lessons Akkad offers for the study of history and the understanding of human civilization itself. Because, let's be honest, every great story, especially one involving ambition, power, and eventual decline, usually has a few takeaways, like a very old, very complex instructional video on how not to repeat certain mistakes, though humanity rarely seems to pay attention to them. The rise and fall of Akkad provides invaluable insights into the dynamics of early state formation, the challenges of imperial rule, and the complex interplay of political, economic, and environmental factors that shape human destiny. Firstly, the Akkadian Empire stands as a monumental testament to the innovation of centralized governance. Before Sargon, Mesopotamia was a region of independent, often warring city-states. Akkad proved that it was possible to transcend this fragmentation and create a vast, unified political entity. This was a revolutionary concept, demonstrating the power of a single, strong leader to organize diverse populations, establish a sophisticated bureaucracy, and project power on an unprecedented scale. It showed that, with enough will and a very good army, you could indeed unite a whole bunch of squabbling neighbors under one roof, even if they sometimes still grumbled about it. This pioneering role in empire building provides a foundational case study for understanding the origins of large-scale political systems, offering a glimpse into humanity's earliest attempts at what we might now call nation building, or at least superstate building. Secondly, Akkad's history powerfully illustrates the inherent fragility and challenges of imperial overextension. While Sargon and Naram-Sin built an astonishing dominion, its vastness ultimately became its Achilles heel. The constant internal rebellions, the difficulty of maintaining communication and control over such a sprawling territory, and the sheer drain on resources and manpower required to suppress dissent and defend extensive borders all contributed to its eventual downfall. The Akkadian experience serves as an early, vivid example of the classic imperial dilemma. How do you expand without stretching yourself so thin that you break? It's a recurring theme in history, from Rome to various modern empires, proving that some lessons are just really hard to learn. Thirdly, the story of Akkad underscores the crucial, often overlooked, role of environmental factors in shaping the course of civilizations. The growing evidence for a severe drought coinciding with the empire's collapse is a stark reminder that human societies, no matter how advanced, are deeply interdependent with their natural environment. A sustained period of climatic stress, leading to agricultural collapse and resource scarcity, can profoundly destabilize even the most formidable political structures, pushing populations into desperation and exacerbating existing tensions. It's a sobering thought that the weather, or rather the lack of it, can be a more formidable foe than any army, a fact that resonates perhaps even more loudly in our own climate-conscious era. Moreover, the Akkadian period offers a fascinating case study in cultural interaction and assimilation. The empire brought distinct Sumerian and Akkadian cultures into close contact, leading to a complex process of blending, adoption, and sometimes fierce resistance. While Akkadian administrative and linguistic influence became dominant, Sumerian traditions were also preserved and later revived. This dynamic interplay between dominant and subjugated cultures, and the ways in which they influence each other, provides valuable insights into the broader processes of cultural diffusion and identity formation in multi-ethnic states. It highlights that conquest is rarely a clean sweep. Cultures tend to adapt and endure, sometimes in surprising ways. Finally, the very fact that the Akkadian Empire was for so long a lost empire, and its rediscovery was a triumph of archaeology and linguistics, emphasizes the importance of historical inquiry and the continuous nature of understanding the past. We often take our knowledge of ancient civilizations for granted, but much of it has been painstakingly pieced together from fragments, deciphered texts, and careful excavation. The story of Akkad reminds us that history is not a static collection of facts, but an ongoing process of discovery, interpretation, and reevaluation, where new evidence can dramatically reshape our understanding of what came before. It's like a perpetually unfinished jigsaw puzzle, where new pieces are always being found in unexpected places. The legacy of Akkad, therefore, is not just about a specific historical period or a particular set of kings. It's about the foundational experiments in human organization, the perennial struggles of power and control, the environmental dependencies that shape our existence, and the enduring power of cultural identity. Its echoes resonate through the subsequent empires of Mesopotamia, Babylonian, Assyrian, and beyond, all of whom, consciously or unconsciously, built upon the Akkadian foundation. So, as we prepare to leave the sandy plains where Akkad once stood, we take with us not just a tale of ancient kings and battles, but a deeper understanding of the enduring forces that continue to shape human societies, from the first empires to our very present day. Our journey through the ancient sands of Mesopotamia has revealed a civilization that, for centuries, was hidden beneath layers of dust and time, a testament to the fact that history isn't just written in books, but also buried in the ground. The very existence of the Akkadian Empire, its rise, its glory, and its eventual fall, is a story that has been painstakingly unearthed by generations of dedicated scholars and archaeologists. The tale of how archaeologists uncovered Akkad is a grand narrative in itself, a testament to intellectual curiosity and the relentless pursuit of knowledge, a bit like a very long, very dusty scavenger hunt with potentially world-changing prizes. For much of modern history, Akkad was little more than a name in ancient, often mythical-sounding texts. The early European explorers and scholars who first ventured into Mesopotamia in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries were primarily focused on biblical sites, or the later, more visually striking ruins of Assyria and Babylon. The true awakening to the deep history of Sumer and Akkad began with the decipherment of cuneiform writing in the mid-19th century. This was the Rosetta Stone moment. But for an entire civilization, allowing scholars like Henry Rawlinson to finally read the wedge-shaped inscriptions that covered countless clay tablets and stone monuments. Suddenly, the voices of ancient Mesopotamians, including the Akkadians, could be heard after millennia of silence. As cuneiform became readable, initial discoveries of texts referring to Akkad and its powerful kings began to surface from various excavation sites. These early texts were tantalizing, speaking of a unified realm and a king named Sargon. But the sheer volume and geographical spread of sites meant that piecing together the narrative was like assembling a giant jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces were missing, and the other half were still buried in someone else's backyard. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw more systematic archaeological excavations across Mesopotamia. British, French, German, and later American archaeological teams began to dig at major Sumerian cities like Ur, Lagash, Uruk, and Nippur. It was at these sites that a significant number of Akkadian period artifacts and inscriptions started to emerge. They found royal inscriptions commemorating Sargon's and Naram-Sin's victories, administrative texts detailing their governance, and literary works showcasing the unique Akkadian language and culture. Each discovery was a tiny window into a world that had been forgotten. One of the most dramatic and iconic finds related to Akkad, as we've mentioned, was the stele of Naram-Sin, discovered in 1898 by Jacques de Morgan in Susa, Elam. While found outside Mesopotamia proper, it was taken as war booty by the Elamites. Its distinct Akkadian style and inscription unequivocally identified it as a product of Naram-Sin's reign. Its artistic quality and detailed iconography immediately placed Akkad squarely on the map of ancient imperial powers. Imagine digging in a completely different country and finding a priceless monument from an empire you barely knew existed. It's an archaeologist's dream. Another pivotal discovery was the bronze head of an Akkadian ruler, found at the Assyrian city of Nineveh in 1931 by Max Mallowan, husband of Agatha Christie, no less, adding a touch of literary intrigue to the archaeological tale. This stunning example of early bronze casting, with its striking features and intricate beard, was instantly recognized for its exceptional artistry and its clear connection to the Akkadian dynastic style, even if its precise identity remains a scholarly mystery to this day. It put a human-like, albeit idealized, face to the abstract concept of an Akkadian emperor. Despite these incredible finds, the precise location of the city of Akkad itself remains one of archaeology's greatest enduring mysteries. Despite numerous surveys and excavations throughout the region between the Tigris and Euphrates, particularly in the area believed to be its general vicinity near Kish and Sippar, the capital city has never been definitively identified. Some theories suggest it lies beneath the modern city of Baghdad, making excavation impossible. Others propose that its ruins were extensively plundered for building materials in antiquity, or that the constant shifting of the rivers and the accumulation of silt have buried it so deeply that it's beyond current archaeological reach. This frustrating elusiveness has only added to the legendary status of Akkad, making it feel almost like a mythical city, even as its influence is undeniably real. Historians still argue whether the city will ever be found, a testament to the challenges of uncovering every secret the earth holds. Modern archaeological methods, including aerial surveys, satellite imagery, and advanced geological techniques, are now being employed to try and solve this riddle. Scientists can analyze subtle changes in soil composition, ancient riverbeds, and faint outlines of buried structures that are invisible from the ground. These technologies offer a renewed hope that one day the hidden heart of the Akkadian Empire might finally reveal itself, adding another thrilling chapter to the story of its discovery. The constant flow of newly deciphered tablets from ongoing excavations and existing museum collections also continues to enrich our understanding of Akkad. Each administrative record, each royal inscription, Each literary fragment adds another brushstroke to the painting, slowly bringing the vibrant life of this ancient empire into sharper focus. The archaeological uncovering of Akkad is a testament to the tireless dedication of those who believe that understanding the past is crucial for understanding ourselves, patiently sifting through the debris of forgotten worlds to reclaim the stories that shaped human civilization. And as long as there's a shovel and a curious mind, the earth will continue to whisper its secrets. As we approach the end of our extended journey through the annals of the Akkadian Empire, it's worth taking a final moment to distill the profound lessons Akkad imparts for understanding the trajectory of history and the very nature of human civilization. Every empire, every civilization, no matter how distant or dust-covered, offers us a mirror to our own aspirations and vulnerabilities. A kind of ancient reality show that's far more compelling than anything on modern television. The rise and fall of Akkad isn't just a fascinating story of kings and conquests. It's a foundational lesson in the enduring patterns that shape human societies across millennia, proving that while technology changes, human nature often sticks to the same script. Firstly, Akkad stands as the ultimate testament to the transformative power of strong centralized leadership and administrative innovation. Before Sargon, Mesopotamia was a fractious land of competing city-states, perpetually squabbling over resources and prestige. Sargon, a man from humble beginnings, envisioned and then forged a unified empire, a monumental leap in political organization, his creation of a standing army, a centralized bureaucracy with loyal governors, standardized weights and measures, and efficient communication networks, fundamentally changed the scale of human governance. This showed that with sufficient vision, ruthless ambition, and logistical genius, a single entity could organize and control vast populations and territories. It's the ancient world's definitive case study for scaling up a political system, demonstrating that hierarchical organization can achieve far more than fragmented local powers, a lesson that would be repeated by countless empires after it. Secondly, Akkad provides a sobering early warning about the perils of imperial overextension and the inherent difficulties of maintaining control over diverse populations. The constant cycle of internal rebellions, from Sargon's early reign through to Naram-Sin's peak and beyond, vividly illustrates that conquest is often easier than lasting governance. The immense resources and manpower continuously drained by suppressing these revolts weakened the empire from within. When you're constantly fighting fires in your own house, it's hard to focus on building new additions or defending against external threats. This highlights the delicate balance between expanding power and sustaining it, a challenge that has plagued every empire throughout history, from the Romans struggling with their vast borders to modern superpowers grappling with global commitments. Thirdly, the narrative of Akkad offers a compelling, albeit tragic, illustration of the vulnerability of even the most powerful human societies to environmental change. The emerging scientific evidence for a severe drought playing a significant role in the empire's final collapse is a potent reminder that our most fundamental needs, food and water, are ultimately dictated by nature's whims. A sustained climatic shift, crippling agriculture, and exacerbating resource scarcity can unravel the social and political fabric of even a highly organized state. This lesson, perhaps more than any other, resonates deeply in our contemporary world, where discussions about climate change and resource security are front and center. It shows that sometimes the biggest threat comes not from an invading army, but from the slow, relentless creep of a changing environment, a foe that cannot be appeased or defeated with spears and shields. Furthermore, Akkad's story illuminates the complex processes of cultural identity and assimilation. The empire brought the ancient Sumerian and the ascendant Akkadian cultures into intimate, often clashing, contact, while Akkadian language and royal ideology became dominant. Sumerian cultural forms persisted, influenced, and were even consciously revived. This shows that cultural change is rarely a one-way street. It's a dynamic, messy process where traditions adapt, borrow, and sometimes stubbornly resist. The resilience of Sumerian culture, despite centuries of Akkadian and Gutian rule, proves that identity, once deeply rooted, is incredibly difficult to erase. A lesson that applies to countless ethnic and national struggles throughout history. Finally, Akkad serves as a powerful reminder of the cyclical nature of history, particularly in Mesopotamia. The pattern of unification under a strong leader, followed by expansion, internal dissent, external pressures, collapse, and then a subsequent period of fragmentation leading to a new powerful entity emerging. This cycle repeats throughout Mesopotamian history, from Akkad to Ur III to Babylon and Assyria. While each empire had its unique characteristics, the underlying dynamic of centralized power, rising and falling in this fertile, contested land, remained remarkably consistent. It's like watching a historical pendulum swing, always returning to a similar arc, even if the scenery changes a bit each time. This understanding of patterns, rather than just isolated events, is one of the profound gifts that the study of ancient empires like Akkad bestows upon us. In sum, the Akkadian Empire was more than just a fleeting moment in ancient history. It was a grand, pioneering experiment that set precedents and established patterns that would echo for millennia. It reminds us of humanity's capacity for incredible organization and achievement, but also of its enduring vulnerabilities to internal division, external pressure, and the sometimes unforgiving hand of nature. As we reflect on Akkad, we don't just look back at a distant past. We gain deeper insight into the enduring forces that continue to shape human societies, reminding us that even in the modern world, the lessons from these ancient, dusty empires remain remarkably relevant, whispering wisdom from across the ages, if only we choose to listen. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting long purple shadows across the imaginary Mesopotamian plains, our long journey through the history of the Akkadian Empire is drawing to a close. We've explored its enigmatic origins, marveled at Sargon's audacious rise, witnessed the golden age of Naram-Sin, grappled with its internal struggles, and considered the external pressures that ultimately led to its downfall. But before we slip into dreams of ziggurats and cuneiform tablets, let's allow our minds to slowly drift, the details softening, the edges blurring, as the grand narrative recedes. Think of those ancient figures, Sargon, Rimush, Manishtushu, Naram-Sin, names that once commanded armies and inspired awe, now just whispers carried on the desert wind. They strode across the earth with ambition and purpose, building an empire that stretched further than anyone had ever imagined possible. Can you feel the weight of their decisions, the dust of their endless campaigns, the quiet hum of their vast bureaucracy. Imagine the bustling markets of Akkad, forever lost beneath layers of time, filled with merchants haggling over copper from Magan or grain from the fertile fields. Their voices echoing in a language that would shape the ancient world. Picture the skilled artisans, their hands deftly working bronze into the majestic head of a king, or carving intricate scenes onto cylinder seals. Each tiny masterpiece a testament to their patience and artistry. Can you hear the rhythmic chants of the priests in the temples, their prayers rising to the heavens, perhaps to Shamash or Ishtar, or perhaps to the newly deified Naram-Sin himself? The air would have been thick with the scent of burning incense, the murmur of the crowd, and the distant sounds of daily life in a thriving, if often tense, imperial capital. It's easy to think of these times as entirely alien, but the rhythms of human existence, the striving, the celebrating, the struggling, remain remarkably consistent across the millennia. Consider the ordinary people of the empire, the farmers tending their fields along the life-giving rivers, their lives inextricably tied to the flow of water and the changing seasons. Imagine the scribes, their fingers calloused from pressing styluses into wet clay, meticulously recording every transaction, every decree, building an administrative edifice that rivaled the pyramids in its complexity, if not in its visible grandeur. They were the unsung heroes of the empire, the silent backbone, ensuring that the wheels of governance, taxation, and trade continued to turn, even when the kings were off conquering distant lands. Their legacy, in the form of countless cuneiform tablets, is perhaps the most intimate connection we have to this lost world, their everyday concerns somehow bridging the vast chasm of time. Feel the quiet tension that must have permeated the empire, the constant underlying hum of potential rebellion, the silent resistance from communities that longed for their old autonomy. Think of the fear in the eyes of a village elder as the Gutian raiders descended from the mountains, their livelihoods and peace shattered by forces beyond their control. This wasn't a static, harmonious empire. It was a dynamic, often brutal, and always precarious balance of power, constantly negotiated with spears, decrees, and sometimes desperate prayers. It reminds us that even under the grandest narratives of empire, the human cost, the personal struggles, are always present, often overlooked but never truly absent. Now, as the last vestiges of our journey begin to fade, let the imagery gently dissolve into the quiet comfort of the present moment. The dust of Akkad has long settled, its cities return to the earth from which they rose. But the stories, the lessons, and the echoes of its pioneering spirit remain whispered through the ages, carried to us by the meticulous work of those who dared to dig beneath the surface of time. The ambition of Sargon, the divine claims of Naram-Sin, the quiet industry of the scribes, the resilience of the Sumerians. All these threads weave into the rich tapestry of human history, a tapestry that continues to unfold, one quiet moment at a time. The grand narratives of power and empire, though sometimes filled with the clatter of bronze and the clamor of conflict, ultimately reveal the shared human desire for order, for prosperity, and for meaning, even as they contend with the inevitable forces of change and decay.